Bramwell Pike didn't knock. He shoved open the door of Jonah Whitaker's farmhouse like he owned it already, because in his mind, he did. He dropped a rolled document on the kitchen table with a crack that made little Pearl flinch behind the stove, and he looked at Jonah the way a man looks at something he's already decided to throw away. "Sign it today," Pike said, "or my crews start grading Monday, whether your fence is still standing or not." Jonah stared at the paper. 400 feet of his eastern pastures creek, his level ground, his father's land, absorbed into Continental Western Railway's expansion, with a single fraudulent line drawn by men who'd never once set foot on his property. "That land's been in my family for 20 years. Pike smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, was he said. "Sign it." If you've ever watched someone try to take everything from a family that had already lost so much, and then watch them fail, you'll want to stay until the very last word of this story. Subscribe to the channel right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Because what Eliza Marlowe did next, a sick, broke woman who arrived in this town with one suitcase and no promises, is something I still think about. Don't go anywhere. The train had been late by 40 minutes, which gave the people of Red Willow 40 extra minutes to stand on the platform and speculate about Jonah Whitaker's mail-order bride. They did not use their time generously. Martha Fenwick, who ran the dry goods store and considered herself the town's unofficial moral record keeper, had positioned herself at the far end of the platform with two other women whose names didn't matter much because they mostly just agreed with whatever Martha said. They watched the track. They watched Jonah. They watched his 4 children standing in a cautious row behind him. Silas, 15, arms crossed, already decided about this. Ruth, 12, trying to look like she didn't care. Eli, 9, fidgeting with the button on his jacket. Pearl, 6 years old, gripping the back of Silas's shirt with both hands. "He should have just hired a housekeeper," Martha said, not quietly. "At least a housekeeper you can let go when she doesn't work out." Nobody disagreed. Jonah heard her. He always heard Martha. He'd been hearing Martha Fenwick's commentary on his choices since the week after his wife Clara died. When Martha had helpfully informed him at Clara's own graveside that he was going to struggle terribly with 4 children and no woman in the house. He had thanked her. He had walked away. He had spent the next 8 months struggling terribly, because Martha wasn't wrong. She was just the last person on earth he'd wanted to be right. He watched the track bend east and disappear behind the low ridge. Ruth appeared at his elbow. "What if she's mean?" Ruth said. Not loudly. "Just to him. Then we figure that out," Jonah said. "What if she doesn't like us?" Ruth. "What?" "Give her 5 minutes before you start worrying." Ruth looked at the track. "I'm not worried. I'm just asking." She was worried. Eli circled around to Jonah's other side. "Pa Danny Mercer says mail-order brides are always ugly. He says that's why they have to be mail-order. Danny Mercer is 12 years old and doesn't know anything about anything." He said, "Eli." "Yeah?" Quiet. The train appeared around the ridge. It slowed with the kind of grinding reluctance that old engines had when they'd been running too long on too little maintenance, a sound like something in pain, gears and steel complaining against each other. Steam rolled across the platform in a low wave, and the crowd shifted, straightening up, adjusting hats, doing the involuntary theater that people do when something is about to happen that they'll want to describe later. 3 passengers stepped off before her. Then Eliza Marlowe came down the steps. Jonah's first thought, though he would never say it aloud to another person, was that she looked like someone who had survived something recently and wasn't entirely sure the surviving was finished. She was thin, genuinely thin, not the delicate thin that the women's magazines described as fashionable, but thin in the way that meant months without enough food. Her dress was clean, but worn at the cuffs and collar. She carried 1 suitcase with both hands, and she walked carefully, like someone who'd learned to conserve what energy she had. She stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at the platform. Her eyes moved across the crowd with an expression that was hard to read, not afraid exactly, but careful. Measuring. She'd walked into a room where everybody already had an opinion of her. Then her eyes found Jonah, and she walked toward him. She stopped 3 feet away and looked at him directly. She had dark eyes, and she didn't drop them. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. "Miss Marlowe," he said. A pause. The kind of pause that happens when two people who've only exchanged letters are suddenly standing 5 feet apart and the letters don't translate the way they expected. She looked at the children. Pearl had moved out from behind Silas and was staring at Eliza with the completely unguarded curiosity of a 6-year-old who hasn't yet learned to pretend she's not staring. Eliza looked back at Pearl. "You must be Pearl," she said. Pearl held up 4 fingers, then thought about it and held up 6. "I'm 6, Pearl said. "I can see that," Eliza said. Something shifted in her expression. Not a full smile, not yet, something smaller than that. Martha Fenwick's voice carried across the platform clearly enough. "Lord, she looks half dead already." Jonah watched Eliza's face. She'd heard it. She heard it clearly, and for just a second, something passed across her expression. A tightening around the eyes, a stillness, and then it was gone. She turned back to Jonah. "I know I don't look like what you expected," she said. Her voice was steady. She wasn't apologizing exactly. She was just naming the truth before he could. "I've been ill. I'm better than I was 6 months ago, and I'll be better still in 6 more. I'm not asking you to take my word for that. I'm just telling you it's accurate." Jonah looked at her for a moment. He looked at his children. He looked back at her. "How long were you ill?" "On and off for almost a year. Fever first, then my lungs. I lost my position, then I lost my room. Then I placed the advertisement." She said it flatly, without theater. Like she was reading a list of facts, not confessing to catastrophe. The honesty of it did something unexpected to Jonah. He'd had enough people in his life who'd smoothed over things, who'd said fine when they meant desperate, who'd said managed when they meant barely. Clara had done that, right up until the end. He'd hated it even while he'd understood it. He picked up her suitcase. She blinked. "Come on," he said. "Wagon's out front." Eliza stood still for a half second, like she'd prepared herself for a different answer and needed a moment to adjust to this one. Then she followed him. She looked at the children as they fell in around her, Ellie immediately curious, Pearl trying to walk next to her, Ruth carefully neutral, Silas trailing 3 feet back with his arms still crossed. "Silas," Jonah said without looking back. Silas uncrossed his arms. He didn't say anything. He kept trailing 3 feet back. Good enough for a first minute. The wagon ride to the ranch took 40 minutes, and Eliza spent most of it asking questions. Not the polite conversational kind of questions designed to fill silence, real ones. She asked Jonah how many acres the ranch ran, which pastures were best for grazing, where the water came from, whether the Eastern Creek ran year-round or went dry in August. Jonah found himself answering more fully than he'd planned. Eli answered the parts Jonah didn't. "The creek goes low in August," Eli said, "but Pa dug a channel 3 years ago, and now it's better." "I helped, Pa, I helped, right?" "You mostly watched," Jonah said. "I handed tools, once, twice," Eli said firmly. Eliza looked at Eli. "Twice as significant," she said seriously. Eli straightened up with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for exactly that kind of acknowledgement. Ruth, sitting across the wagon bed, watched Eliza with an expression that had moved from carefully neutral to something more complicated. Ruth was 12 and had been the closest thing this family had to a woman of the house for 8 months, making sure Pearl's hair was braided, reminding Silas to check on the animals, keeping track of what provisions were running low. She had done all of that without being asked, because someone had to, and because Ruth was the kind of person who did things that needed doing. She wasn't certain yet whether Eliza's arrival was a relief or a threat to the particular authority she'd assembled. Eliza seemed to sense something of this. She didn't try to charm Ruth. She didn't make a speech about wanting to be her friend. She just asked her quietly which of the 4 children was going to give her the most trouble settling in. Ruth was startled enough that she answered honestly. "Silas. He's 15, he thinks he's 30. Boys that age usually do," Eliza said. "It passes." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "How long does it take?" "Depends on the boy," Eliza said. 2 years. Sometimes 4. Ruth looked at Silas, who was sitting at the back of the wagon, staring at the road they'd already passed. "Great," Ruth said, and that, without either of them intending it, was the beginning of something. The ranch house was plainer than Eliza had imagined from Jonah's letters, and more honest for it. No pretension, no attempt at grandeur. A practical house built by practical hands, added onto as the family grew. Clean enough given what it was, a household of 1 man and 4 children, managing without a woman for 8 months. Jonah showed her the room that would be hers small, with a window that faced east and a bed with a quilt that Pearl had already examined and approved. "It's good," Pearl announced, patting the quilt. "I tested it." "How do you test a quilt?" Eliza asked. "You sit on it and see if it's soft." "Did it pass?" "Yes," Pearl said very seriously. "It's soft." Eliza set her suitcase on the floor beside the bed. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Jonah stood in the doorway, and there was a kind of awkward geography to it, the space between what the letters had implied and what this actual moment was. "I want to be straightforward with you about something," Jonah said. Eliza looked at him. "She was their mother," he said. "Clara, she isn't replaceable. I'm not asking you to be her. What I need is someone who can help with the children, help manage the household." And he stopped, cleared his throat. "And who isn't going to leave in 3 months when things get hard." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. "I understand what you're telling me," she said. "And I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm here because I needed a place and you needed help. If that turns into something more than that over time, then it does. If it doesn't, we manage anyway." Jonah nodded once. "That's a sensible answer," he said. "I'm a sensible person," Eliza said, "when I have the energy for it." Something almost happened in his expression. Not a smile, something on its way to one. He left her to settle. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, not unpacking, just sitting. She had done a thing that felt impossible 6 months ago when she was burning with fever in a rented room in Cheyenne, unable to work, watching her savings dissolve, writing a matrimonial advertisement in the margins of a newspaper because it was either that or something she didn't want to think about. She had done the thing. She was here. She looked out the window at the eastern pasture, darkening now as evening came on. She didn't know yet that the land she was looking at, the good flat ground, the gentle slope down to the creek, was already at the center of something that was going to pull this family apart if nobody stopped it. She didn't know yet what she was going to have to do. But she was here. That was the first thing. 3 days after Eliza arrived, Bramwell Pike rode into the yard. She was splitting kindling beside the woodpile when he came through the gate on a gray horse, and she noticed him the way you notice a certain type of man, the kind who moves through a space like everything in it is already his business. Well-dressed, expensive boots, the kind of hat that cost more than a working man's monthly wage. She kept splitting kindling. He didn't look at her right away. He tied his horse at the post and went to the house, and she heard him knock, heard Jonah answer, heard them move inside. She finished the kindling, stacked it, and went inside to start supper, and stopped in the kitchen doorway when she heard the word survey. She didn't announce herself. She stood just outside the kitchen and listened. "Been extremely patient with you, Whitaker," Pike was saying. "The company's position hasn't changed. The official survey marks your eastern boundary at 380 feet shorter than your deed claims. Your deed is 40 years old. Survey measurements have been corrected since then. That's not unusual. That's how land records work. That creek has been Whitaker land since my father." "I understand your attachment," Pike said, and the sympathy in his voice was so thin it was almost transparent. "But attachment isn't a legal document. Continental Western has official measurements filed with the county. Those measurements show that approximately 400 feet of your eastern pasture falls within our right-of-way." A silence. "What does that mean practically?" Jonas said. "It means," Pike said, "that construction begins in 3 weeks. If you cooperate, we'll grade around the structures currently on the disputed section. If I don't cooperate, the law is quite clear about who has standing." Eliza stepped into the kitchen. Both men turned. Pike looked at her the way men like him usually looked at women who appeared in doorways. A quick assessment, a rapid filing away of her relevance or lack of it. He filed her quickly. "Mr. Whitaker's wife," he said. "I'll be his wife," Eliza said. "We haven't had the ceremony yet." "Ah," his eyes moved over her plainly enough. "The advertisement." "Bramwell Pike," Jonah said, with a flatness in his voice that meant he was working at keeping something controlled. "Continental Western Railway." "Miss Marlowe," Eliza said. "Miss Marlowe." Pike produced a practiced smile. "I apologize for interrupting the household. Mr. Whitaker and I were just discussing a business matter." I heard some of it, Eliza said. She pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table, which was where the rolled survey documents were. Are these the measurements you're referring to? Pike looked at the documents. Then at her. Those are official Continental Western Survey filings. Can I look at them? They're company documents. They're sitting on his kitchen table, Eliza said reasonably. So they're here. May I look? She said it the way a person says something that isn't actually a question, and before Pike had finished deciding whether to object, she'd already unrolled the top document and was looking at it. She looked at it for almost a full minute. Pike watched her with the kind of attention a man gives something he's decided is harmless, but can't quite stop watching. Do you have the original county filing reference number? Eliza asked. I beg your pardon? The county filing reference. Every official survey filed with the county gets a reference number recorded in the register. This document has a Continental Western internal number, but I don't see the county reference. Pike was quiet for a moment. That information would be at the county office, he said. These are working copies. Of course, Eliza said pleasantly. She rolled the document back up. Thank you for stopping by, Mr. Pike. Pike looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Mr. Whitaker, he said, turning back to Jonah, 3 weeks. The company prefers to resolve these matters without involving the county court. Think carefully about that. He left. Jonah waited until he heard the horse leave the yard. Then he looked at Eliza. What did you see in that document? He said. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Probably nothing, she said. But she looked out the window toward the east pasture. Do you have your original deed? And any survey records from when your father first filed on this land? Jonah's expression shifted. I have the deed, he said slowly. I have some maps Eli made of the eastern section. He's got a good eye for that kind of thing. And he stopped. There might be some old documents in the chest in the back room. Things my father kept. Can I look at them? He studied her. What did you see? He asked again. She looked at him. She'd been in this house 4 days. And she was already sitting at the center of something that was none of her business, and also, in some way she couldn't quite articulate yet, completely her business. The bearing on the eastern boundary, she said. It's described as north 43 degrees east on the Continental Western document. That's a very specific bearing for that kind of terrain. She paused. When I worked with surveyors before, that same type of creek boundary and that type of terrain almost always runs closer to north 38 or 39 degrees. It's the way water cuts through this kind of rock gradient. Jonah was very still. 5 degrees, he said. 4 to 5 degrees, Eliza said. On a boundary this long, even 3 degrees is the difference between hundreds of feet. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Pearl could be heard asking Eli something about a horse, and Eli's voice answering with authority he may or may not have possessed. You worked with surveyors, Jonah said. For 7 years, Eliza said. Before I was ill. My father was a surveyor. I worked alongside him and then alongside his firm after he died. I'm not a licensed surveyor. I want to be clear about that. But I can read a survey document, and I know what the numbers are supposed to say. Jonah sat down across from her at the kitchen table. And what do the numbers say? He asked. I don't know yet, Eliza said. That's why I need to see your father's documents. The documents in the back chest were a thing. Lisa would think about that later, about how much of a person's life could be folded into a flat box of paper. Jonah's father's handwriting across old survey notes, the corners of things soft from handling, the smell of them. Maps drawn before the county had a proper register, before the land office in Denver had standardized anything. She spread them on the kitchen table that night after supper and sat with a candle and Jonah's old deed while the children slept. She was still there 2 hours later when she found the first federal benchmark record. She sat back. She looked at the number. She looked at the Continental Western bearing again. She pulled out a piece of paper and started calculating. An hour after that, she was certain. She sat in the kitchen of a man she'd known for 4 days, in a house she'd lived in for less than a week, in a town that had already decided what she was worth, and she held in her hand evidence that a powerful railway company had manipulated a survey boundary by nearly 5 degrees across 400 feet of some of the most productive land on this ranch. They hadn't made a mistake. She knew the difference between a mistake and a choice. She'd spent years around people who made both. You could see it in the numbers. A mistake was random. It compounded unpredictably. It showed up in multiple places across a survey, in ways that didn't benefit anyone consistently. This wasn't random. Every manipulation pushed in exactly the same direction. Toward the creek, toward the level ground, toward the precise location where a railway depot would need flat, stable earth and reliable water. She set down her pencil. She understood, suddenly and completely, that this was not just about Jonah's ranch. If they'd done this here, they'd done it elsewhere. She was still sitting at the table when Jonah appeared in the kitchen doorway, and he was clearly surprised to find her there. "It's past midnight," he said. "I know." He looked at the spread of papers. He came and stood beside the table and looked at the calculations she'd written. "What does this mean?" he said. She looked up at him. "It means somebody stole your land with mathematics," she said. "And I think I can prove it." Jonah was quiet for a long time. He looked at the papers. He looked at her face, tired, certain, something in her eyes that had nothing to do with a woman who'd arrived sick and desperate a week ago. "How?" he said. "There's a federal survey stone," Eliza said. "Your father's notes reference it. A boundary marker placed by the Federal Land Office, decades before Continental Western existed. If it's still there, if we can find it, its coordinates would predate anything Continental Western has filed. They can't have altered something they didn't know existed." Jonah looked at the eastern window, at the darkness beyond it. "That marker could be buried," he said. "Could be gone." "Could be," Eliza said. "You've been here a week." "I know. You're supposed to be resting." "I know that, too." He was quiet. Pearl's voice drifted down from the upstairs in that vague, half-asleep way that children make sounds without waking. Just noise, just the sound of a small person present in the world. "If we go looking," Jonah said, "and we find nothing." "Then we find nothing," Eliza said. "But if we find it." She didn't finish the sentence because he was already nodding. "Tomorrow," he said. After the morning feed, he started to leave. Stopped in the doorway. "Eliza." She looked up. "I don't know why you're doing this," he said. "You've been here a week. You don't owe this family." "I slept in a real bed last night," she said. "First time in 4 months." Pearl tested the quilt. She looked back at her papers. "I owe something for that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to bed. She sat at the kitchen table a while longer, alone in the late-night silence of a house that wasn't hers yet, with documents that proved a crime no one had caught yet, in a body that was still recovering, in a life that was still, in some essential and fragile way, being rebuilt from the floor up. She blew out the candle. She went to her room. She lay down on Pearl's tested and approved quilt and looked at the ceiling, and what she felt was not triumph or fear or even the exhaustion she probably should have felt. What she felt, strangely, for the first time in a long time, was that she was in the right place. She couldn't explain it. She fell asleep anyway. The morning after Eliza sat up until midnight with Jonah's father's papers, she woke before anyone else in the house. That wasn't unusual for her. Illness had rearranged her sleep the way it rearranged everything. She surfaced too early, lay in the dark listening to a body that had once simply functioned without consultation, and waited for the point where getting up made more sense than lying still. In Cheyenne, in the rented room, that waiting had been grim. Here it was different. Here there were sounds. A horse shifting in the barn, wind across the eastern pasture, Pearl turning over upstairs with the specific thump of a small child changing position. She got up, dressed, and started the stove. By the time Jonah came downstairs, she had coffee made and was sitting at the table with his father's survey notes again. Because she'd been thinking about one specific entry in the pre-dawn dark, and she needed to check it against the bearing she'd calculated the night before. Jonah stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "You slept," he said. It wasn't really a question. "Some," she said. "There's coffee." He poured himself a cup and came and stood beside the table, looking down at the papers. He'd clearly been thinking, too. There was a set to his jaw that meant something had been working in him through the night hours. "The marker my father referenced," he said. "I think I know the general area. There's a section of the eastern ridge where the terrain changes limestone shelf, coming up through the soil. My father used to talk about it. He said the federal surveyors always marked near rock because it didn't shift the way soft ground did." Eliza looked up. That makes sense. Rock benchmarks are more stable. If they placed it on the shelf, it could still be there, Jonah said. Buried, she said. Maybe. The vegetation out there is thick. But the stone itself wouldn't have moved. He drank his coffee. Set the cup down. I need to feed the stock first, he said. And Silas is behind on the fence line in the north pasture. I promised him we'd look at it today. Of course. Could be afternoon before we get out to the eastern section. Afternoon is fine, Eliza said. He looked at her for a moment. She'd gone back to the survey notes, and there was something about the way she held a document close, slightly angled, moving her finger across the numbers, that reminded him, strangely, of the way Ruth read. Focused in a way that closed out everything peripheral. He went to feed the stock. Eli came down at 6 and immediately looked at the papers on the table with the bright-eyed interest of a 9-year-old who has decided that whatever the adults are doing is probably the most interesting thing happening. Are those Pa's old maps? He said. Some of them, Eliza said. And your grandfather's survey notes. Eli slid into a chair across from her and examined the nearest document with the authority of someone who didn't know enough to be uncertain. I've been to the Eastern Ridge, he said, 3 times. Pa takes us in the fall to check the fence line where it meets the Gruber property. Eliza looked at him. Do you remember anything about the terrain there? Specifically around the limestone section? Eli thought about this with genuine seriousness. He was a child who liked being asked real questions and didn't like being given simplified ones. There's a flat rock, he said slowly. Big one, sticking up out of the ground. Me and Danny Mercer used to climb on it. Pa told us not to, but we did anyway. He paused. You're not going to tell Pa about that. I don't know anything about that, Eliza said. Eli nodded, satisfied. The flat rock, Eliza said carefully. Was there anything near it? Old metal, old stone, with markings. There's a piece of iron in the ground near it, Eli said. I always thought it was from a fence post that rusted away. It's kind of square at the top. Eliza went very still. How deep in the ground, she said. Eli held his hand about 6 inches above the table. The top of a federal survey monument would be a square iron cap flush with, or just below ground level, driven into a stone base. It would look, to a 9-year-old, exactly like a rusted old fence post that had lost its rail. Eli, Eliza said, could you draw me where that rock is, relative to the fence line and the creek? He could. He did. He drew with the focused pleasure of a child who'd been given permission to do something useful, and the map he produced was rough but spatially coherent. The creek bending south, the fence line angling northeast. The large flat rock sitting on the limestone shelf above where the 2 lines would theoretically meet. Eliza laid his drawing beside his grandfather's survey notes. The location matched within a reasonable margin for a 9-year-old's memory map. Her hands weren't entirely steady when she folded Eli's drawing and set it carefully beside her own calculations. Eli, she said, don't tell anyone about this conversation today. Not even Ruth. Eli looked at her with 9-year-old solemnity. Is this a secret? She considered that. It's something we need to check before we make it anybody's business, she said. Can you do that? Yes, Eli said. Then am I helping? You might have just helped more than you know, Eliza said. Eli went back upstairs, walking about 3 inches taller than he'd come down. The problem with Silas materialized at breakfast. He came downstairs last, sat at the far end of the table, and ate in the focused silence of someone who had decided that this particular morning meal did not require him to participate in anything. Pearl chattered. Eli ate with the self-conscious dignity of someone keeping a secret. Ruth moved between the stove and the table in the practiced way she'd developed over 8 months, and Eliza watched her for a moment, the way Ruth automatically checked who needed more, who was almost done, where things were running low, and felt a complicated kind of recognition. Ruth was 12 years old and had been managing this kitchen like a 30-year-old for most of a year. Sit down, Eliza said. Ruth looked at her. I was just going to get. I'll get it, Eliza said. Sit. Ruth sat uncertainly. Eliza refilled Jonah's coffee and brought more biscuits from the stove and sat back down, and the kitchen recalibrated slightly. You don't have to run the kitchen, Eliza said, not loudly, just to Ruth. That's not your job anymore. Ruth looked at her with an expression that had several things in it at once. I don't mind, Ruth said. I know you don't. I'm telling you anyway. A silence. "I did it better than Pa did," Ruth said. Not bragging, just a statement of observed fact. "I believe that completely," Eliza said. "But you're 12. Silas looked up from his plate for the first time. "She's been doing it since Ma died," he said. His voice was flat. Not mean, exactly. Just flat in the way of someone stating a fact they find you should already know. "I know," Eliza said. "Then you know she doesn't need to be told to stop," Silas said. "I'm not telling her to stop doing things," Eliza said. "I'm telling her she doesn't have to carry the whole weight of it anymore." Silas looked at her for a long moment. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, Eliza guessed, though she'd never seen Clara Whitaker's face. There was something guarded in him that was specific and considered, not the general suspicion of a teenager, but the particular wariness of a boy who had watched someone he loved die and had decided since then to preassign a limited budget of trust to new things. He looked back at his plate. "We'll see," he said. It wasn't welcoming, but it wasn't the door slamming shut either. That afternoon, Jonah and Eliza rode east. He'd offered to bring Eli for his knowledge of the terrain, but Eliza had thought it better to leave the children out of this until they knew what they had or didn't have. If the marker wasn't there, she didn't want Eli carrying the weight of having led them to nothing. If it was there, the fewer people who knew about it before they could document it properly, the better. So it was just the two of them, riding out through the eastern pasture on a mild October afternoon, with a copy of Eli's drawing and Jonah's father's survey notes folded in Eliza's coat pocket. The eastern section of the Whitaker ranch was different from the home pasture. The terrain rose gradually. The ground changed from soft soil to harder rocky earth, and the vegetation thickened along the creek's edges. It was good land. Eliza could see immediately why a railway would want the creek. It ran clear and steady, even in autumn, and the flat bench of ground above it would take a rail bed without much grading. Which was exactly the point. They found the limestone shelf after 40 minutes of riding. The flat rock was exactly where Eli had drawn it, a broad, pale slab pushing up through the earth at the edge of the shelf, the kind of thing that made a natural landmark and that small boys would inevitably climb on, despite parental instructions to the contrary. Jonah dismounted. Eliza dismounted. They walked to the flat rock. "He said the iron was near it," Eliza said, "on the uphill side." They looked. The ground was dense with autumn-dried grass and low scrub, the kind of thick ground cover that built up over decades. Eliza crouched and started moving the scrub with her hands, methodically, working in a grid pattern outward from the uphill edge of the flat rock. Jonah worked beside her. For 20 minutes they found nothing except cold earth and old roots. Then Jonah's hand hit something that didn't move. He pulled the grass back. It was square, iron. The top of it was about 2 inches below the surface, and when Eliza ran her fingers across it, she could feel markings stamped into the metal numbers, worn but still present. She sat back on her heels. She looked at Jonah. He looked at her. "Get the notes," she said. He handed her his father's survey notes. She opened them to the specific entry she'd flagged the night before, the one that recorded a federal benchmark station, with coordinates placed on the eastern Whitaker boundary in 1851. She compared the coordinates to the number she'd calculated from the bearing in the Continental Western Survey. Then she did a thing that surprised Jonah, who was watching. She laughed. Not a happy laugh, and not a defeated one, just a short, involuntary sound of something that had been held as a probability suddenly becoming a fact. "It's almost exactly where it should be," she said. Given the coordinate records, Jonah crouched beside her. He looked at the iron cap. He looked at his father's handwriting in the survey notes. "What does that mean?" he said, in plain terms. "It means," Eliza said, "that your father's original deed boundaries were correct. That this marker was placed here by federal surveyors before Continental Western existed, and its position matches your deed and contradicts their survey by approximately the margin I calculated last night." She sat back. "It means the land they're claiming belongs to you. It was always yours. And their survey documents." She stopped, steadied herself. "Jonah, their bearing is wrong in a direction that benefits them exactly. This isn't a correction. This is fraud." The word sat between them in the cold afternoon air. Jonah was quiet for a long time. He looked at the iron cap in the earth, at his father's notes in Eliza's hands, at the creek running below them through land he'd ridden his whole life. Will anyone believe it, he said. They've got lawyers. They've got county filings. They've got county filings that may or may not have existed before they filed their survey, Eliza said. That's the piece I need to check. If the county land records were updated after Continental Western filed their measurements, if they used their own numbers to verify their own numbers. She stopped. That's the thing that breaks it open. Jonah stood. He brushed the earth from his hands. You talk about this like you've dealt with it before, he said. Eliza stood. She folded the notes back carefully. I've seen it before, she said. Not land fraud. Different work. But the principle is the same. Someone changes a number in a record and then uses the changed record as proof that the number was always that way. She paused. It works until someone who knows what to look for is looking. Jonah looked at her. And you know what to look for, he said. I know what I'm looking for here, she said. I can't promise I'll find all of it. And I want to be clear, if we take this to court, they'll come after me. They'll question everything I say. My credentials, my character. She stopped. There are things in my past that can be weaponized. I want you to know that before we go further. Jonah looked at her for a long moment. The wind came across the shelf, and she shivered slightly. She was still not all the way back to herself, and she probably should have dressed warmer. What kind of things, he said. I was investigated once, Eliza said, for falsifying field records, at my last position before I was ill. The investigation cleared me completely. I have the documentation. But it existed. A good attorney will find it. Were you guilty? Jonah said. No, she said. He studied her face. All right, he said. All right, she said. You said you were cleared. I'm choosing to believe that, he said. It wasn't sentimental. It was the same measured flatness he applied to most things. If they use it against you in court, we deal with that then. She looked at him. You're easier to trust than I expected, she said. Don't spread that around, he said. It'll ruin my reputation. She almost smiled. They rode back with the survey notes and Eli's drawing and the knowledge of what sat in the ground on the eastern shelf. They didn't speak much on the ride. Eliza spent most of it running through the sequence she'd need to follow County Land Office, records comparison, the specific entries she'd need to examine, to establish when Continental Western supporting documents had been filed relative to their survey. She didn't notice until they were nearly back to the house that she'd spent the entire ride thinking about the problem, and not about her lungs or her hands or whether she was well enough to do this. That was the first time since she'd arrived that her body had stopped occupying the front of her mind. She noticed it. She filed it away. The trouble arrived 4 days later in the form of Bramwell Pike riding into town with a man named Augustus Vane. Eliza was at the county land office when they arrived in Red Willow. She'd been there all morning, working through the ledgers with the careful patience she'd learned from years of field surveys, cross-referencing dates, looking for the specific entries that would tell her when the county records had been amended. She'd found 2 of them. 2 entries in the land register that referenced Continental Western boundary measurements, both recorded under a date stamp that when compared to the original ledger sequence came from a page that had been inserted rather than continuous. The paper was slightly different. The ink density was consistent with a batch, not with organic entries over time. She was sitting with this when she heard voices in the outer office and recognized one of them. She didn't move. She kept her place in the ledger with one finger and listened. Eliza Marlowe, Pike's voice said. She's been in here asking questions about county filings, Martin. I need to know exactly what she's accessed. Martin Holt, the county clerk, was a man of about 50 who had so far been professionally neutral in Eliza's interactions with him, helpful enough, but careful to stay clearly on the side of being helpful to whoever needed him most. She's been looking at boundary records, Holt said. Eastern section, Whitaker property. Nothing outside normal public access. I need those records restricted, Pike said. A pause. They're public documents, Mr. Pike. I can't restrict access to public. I need them reviewed before anyone else looks at them, Pike said. There may be filing errors. Continental Western wants to ensure. I'll need a written request from the company, Holtz said, and approval from the county commissioner. Another pause. Longer this time. Fine, Pike said. I'll have that by Friday. Then, lower, the woman looking at those records, who is she exactly? Other than Whitaker's arrangement. Holt's voice dropped too, but not enough. She was a surveyor's assistant, apparently. Before she came here, a surveyor's assistant, Pike said. The contempt in his voice was mild and complete. The contempt of a man who found the phrase inherently self-refuting. Eliza closed the ledger carefully and stood up. She walked to the doorway. Both men turned. Pike looked at her. Beside him was a man she didn't recognize, around 60, lean, with the kind of weather-worked face that came from years of outdoor work. He looked at Eliza with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "Miss Marlowe," Pike said, recovering instantly into smoothness. "I didn't realize you were still here. I was finishing some reading," Eliza said pleasantly. "I'll need to return Thursday, Mr. Holt, if that works. I have a few more entries to cross-reference." Holt looked between her and Pike and made the calculation of a man who'd been a county clerk, long enough to recognize that he was standing in the middle of something he didn't fully understand. "Thursday's fine," he said. Eliza looked at the man beside Pike. "I don't think we've met," she said. Pike interposed smoothly, Augustus Vane. "He's consulting with Continental Western on the survey technical questions." Vane looked at her steadily. There was something in his face, a kind of evaluation that was less dismissive than Pike's and more genuinely focused. "You've been looking at the boundary records," Vane said. "Not accusatory. Just observational. Public documents," Eliza said. "Former surveyor," Vane said. "Surveyor's assistant." 7 years. He nodded once. Slowly. "Then you know what you're looking at," he said. "Getting there," she said. There was a beat. Pike was watching both of them, with the slightly impatient look of a man who'd set a scene and wasn't entirely sure it was playing out the way he'd intended. "If you have technical questions about Continental Western's survey process," Pike said to Eliza, "Mr. Vane would be happy to address them directly. No need to," he gestured vaguely at the ledgers behind her. "Go looking through records when we can just answer your questions." "That's generous," Eliza said, "but I'll keep reading if it's all the same." She collected her coat and her notebook and left. She walked back to the wagon with the particular careful pace of someone who is not going to let anyone watch her hurry. When she got to the wagon, she sat down on the seat and permitted herself 30 seconds of having shaking hands. Then she opened her notebook and wrote down everything she'd just seen. Who said what? The exact phrasing Pike had used with Holt. The name Augustus Vane. She'd heard that name before. It took her until she was nearly back to the ranch to place it. Augustus Vane had been the supervisor on a federal survey project she'd worked on during her 4th year with her father's firm. He was the supervisor who had made the initial accusation against her. The accusation that had been investigated and dismissed. The accusation that she'd spent 2 years putting behind her. And he was now in Red Willow, working for Continental Western, consulting on the exact survey dispute she was in the middle of. She sat with that for the rest of the drive and didn't like what she found when she thought it through. This wasn't coincidence. Jonah was fixing a hinge on the barn door when she came back, and he read her face before she said anything. "What happened?" he said. She told him. He put down the hinge. He was quiet for a moment. "This Vane," he said. "He's the one who accused you." "Investigated," she said. "Made the initial report that prompted an investigation. The investigation cleared me, but he knows the history." "He was the history," Eliza said, "and now Pike has him here." She looked at the barn wall. "They weren't reacting to what I've found yet. They're getting ahead of it. Pike knows I've been looking at the records, and he brought in the one person who can most credibly attack my credibility before I get anywhere near a courtroom. If he testifies that you falsified records before, if he testifies that the accusation existed, that there was ever an investigation, it plants doubt. Even if the outcome was full clearance, the word investigated is enough for most people." She looked at Jonah. "I told you they'd come after me. This is what that looks like." Jonah put his hand on the barn wall. He looked at the ground. He was doing the calculation she could almost see happening in him. The same calculation she'd already made, which was whether the risk of pursuing this was greater than the risk of losing 400 feet of his father's land. "The documents that cleared you," he said. "You have them?" "In my suitcase," she said. "I've carried them since the day the investigation closed. She stopped. "When something like that happens to you, you learn to keep the evidence." He looked at her. "Then that's your answer to whatever he says," Jonah said. "You have the proof. It's not that simple in a courtroom. Is anything? He said. She looked at him. He'd said it without irony, just as a genuine question, and the simplicity of it did something unexpected cut through the spiral of what if she'd been running on the drive back. No, she said, nothing is. Then we go to the county commissioner, he said. Tomorrow. We tell them about the altered ledger pages before Pike gets his written request in. I need one more look at those records first, Eliza said. There's a third entry I didn't finish checking. Thursday you told Holt. Thursday, she said. 2 days. He nodded. In the meantime, he said, what about Vane? Is there any chance he's here because he genuinely believes what he testified before? That he made an honest mistake? Eliza thought about it. She thought about the way Vane had looked at her in the county office, that flat, focused evaluation that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite threat. I don't know, she said honestly. He's not a dishonest man overall. He made a bad call on an ambiguous situation, and the investigation corrected it. But Pike will have told him what's at stake for Continental Western, and she paused. People make different choices when money is involved. Jonah looked at her. Don't you always? Not always, she said. Not everyone. He held her look for a moment, and it was one of those moments quiet and ordinary, and happening in a barn in October, that had a weight to it she didn't know yet how to name. Get the documents out of your suitcase tonight, he said. Put them somewhere that isn't your room. She understood him. He meant somewhere she could access them, even if something happened, if Pike found a way to make trouble before she'd completed her review. The chest where you kept your father's papers, she said. Good, he said. He picked up the hinge and went back to work, and Eliza went back to the house. What she didn't expect was Silas. He was on the porch, sitting on the steps, with his knees up, and he watched her come across the yard with the particular observational patience of a boy who had decided to notice things without making it obvious he was doing so. She stopped at the bottom step. He looked at her. You went to the county office, he said. Yes, about the railway thing, yes. Silas was quiet. He looked at the eastern horizon, at the ridge that separated the home pasture from the land the railway wanted. My father doesn't fight things as a rule, Silas said. He works around them. He finds another way. I know, Eliza said. This is different, Silas said. He's going to fight this one. I know, she said again. Because of you, Silas said. Not accusatory, just naming something. Because of what we found, Eliza said. I didn't put the fraud there. I just found it. Silas looked at her for a long moment. He had that quality, the same one Ruth had, and Eli, all three of them, not pretending an opinion he didn't have. My mother would have said to document everything twice, he said. Eliza blinked. She was like that, Eliza said. She kept records of everything. Household accounts, livestock, weather. Said you never knew which record would be the one that mattered. He paused. Pa kept all her books. They're in the chest in the back room. He stood up. I know where the chest is, he said. If you need something kept safe. He went inside. Eliza stood on the bottom step of a porch in Colorado Territory in October, in the cooling late afternoon light, and felt something shift in a place she'd been keeping carefully still since the day she arrived, the place that was waiting to see whether this was temporary or real. It hadn't been a welcome, exactly. Silas was too precise for that. It had been something better. It had been an offer. She went inside and got her documents out of her suitcase, and she put them in the chest in the back room, beneath Clara Whitaker's household records, in a house that was slowly, unevenly, and without anyone's explicit permission, becoming hers. Thursday came with frost on the ground and a sky the color of old pewter, and Eliza was up before the frost melted. She'd spent Wednesday going through Clara Whitaker's household records, not because she'd planned to, but because they were in the chest alongside her own documents, and she'd opened them without thinking, and then couldn't stop reading. Clara had kept meticulous accounts, every supply purchase, every livestock transaction, every weather note. 7 years of precise, undecorated record-keeping, in a handwriting that was smaller and neater than Eliza had expected from a frontier ranch wife. What she hadn't expected was to find, tucked into the back of the third ledger, a folded piece of paper in a different hand holder, shakier, that turned out to be a letter from Jonah's father to Clara, written 2 years before he died, describing in plain terms exactly where he'd driven the Federal Survey iron on the eastern shelf and why. He'd written it because he didn't trust the railway surveyors who'd come through the territory that summer, asking questions and measuring things they had no business measuring yet. He'd written, "I want someone to know where it is in case I'm not here to say." Eliza had sat with that letter for a long time. Then she'd put it with her own documents in the chest and gone to bed, and not slept particularly well. So Thursday morning she was on the road to the county office before Jonah had finished his first cup of coffee, with her notebook and a copy of every relevant document she'd assembled, and a specific plan for what she needed to find in the third ledger entry before Pike's written request arrived and Holt closed access. Jonah had offered to come. "I need you here," she said. "If Pike or Vane come to the ranch while I'm in town, I need someone who can account for exactly where I've been and what I've been doing." He'd looked at her. "You think they'd try something while you're gone?" "I think Pike is smart enough to know that 2 days is enough time for me to find something he doesn't want found," she said. "I think he'll move on the records restriction, and I think he may try to reach you directly with another offer before the week is out." "He'd be wasting his time," Jonah said. "I know that," Eliza said. "But he doesn't yet." She'd driven the wagon herself. She wasn't entirely sure her lungs were ready for the cold morning air. There was a tightness in her chest that she recognized and that she was choosing to ignore, but she drove anyway. Because waiting for perfect physical readiness was a luxury that the next 3 days didn't offer. Martin Holt was already at his desk when she arrived, and he looked up with an expression that had something careful in it, the expression of a man who'd been thinking about Wednesday afternoon and had not entirely settled on what to make of it. "Miss Marlowe," he said. "Good morning," she said. "I'd like to continue with the Eastern Boundary records, if that's still all right." A pause, brief but present. "I haven't received the restriction request yet," he said. "So the records are still open. I appreciate that," she said. He brought the ledgers. She found what she was looking for in 40 minutes. The third entry, the one she hadn't finished checking Wednesday, was a boundary reference recorded under a date stamp in June of 1887. The Continental Western Survey had been filed in April of 1887. By the sequence logic she'd already established, this entry should have been recorded before the railway survey. It hadn't been. The paper, the ink density, the position in the ledger sequence, all of it said the same thing. This entry had been inserted after April 1887. Someone had placed documentation in the county records that appeared to predate the Continental Western Survey, but had actually been created afterward. They hadn't just filed a fraudulent survey. They'd built a fraudulent paper trail to support it. Eliza sat back in her chair and looked at the ledger page and felt something that was partly cold satisfaction and partly a kind of weariness, because she'd known this was what she'd find, and knowing a thing and finding it were different weights. She spent the next hour making careful, exact notes. Not summaries, transcriptions. The exact entry text, the exact date stamp, the exact position in the ledger sequence, the paper characteristics she could document in writing. She was precise in the way she'd learned from 7 years of field work, which was that the notes had to stand alone, had to communicate everything to someone who hadn't been in the room, because the notes were all that survived when the room was gone. When she was done, she closed the ledger and sat for a moment. Then she went to Holt's desk. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I'd like you to think about it carefully before you answer." He looked up. "These boundary records," she said, "the ledger entries from 1887. Do you know who filed the June entry?" Holt was quiet for a moment that was a fraction too long. "That would have been recorded by whoever brought the filing," he said. "Do you keep a receipt log? A record of who presents documents for entry?" Another pause. "We're supposed to," he said. "Do you?" "Sometimes," he said. "Would the June 1887 period be covered?" He stood up. He went to a different cabinet. He looked for several minutes, and she watched his face during the looking, and what she saw was a man who was beginning to understand what was sitting in his own ledgers. He found a receipt log from 1887. He opened it to June. There was no receipt entry for the boundary filing. He stood there holding the log. "Mr. Holt," Eliza said, "I think you should look carefully at the April through August 1887 section of those boundary records before you accept any restriction request." Because if someone files to restrict access after you've had a chance to examine them, that's one thing. But if you restrict them before you've looked, and there's something in them that matters. She stopped. I'm not telling you how to do your job. I understand what you're telling me, Holt said. His voice was flat, and he was still looking at the open receipt log. She left him there. She was back on the road before noon. The county commissioner's office was her next stop, and she got there just before the lunch hour, when Commissioner Aldous Briggs was eating a sandwich at his desk and was not especially pleased to be interrupted. He was a large man in his 60s who had the particular quality of someone who had held local authority long enough to regard most visitors as problems until proven otherwise. He heard her out. He ate his sandwich during most of it. When she finished, he looked at her over his desk. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "you are the Whitaker woman." "I will be," she said. "We haven't had the ceremony yet." "And before that you were a surveyor's assistant." "Correct. And you're telling me that Continental Tunnel Western Southern Railway has committed document fraud in my county records." "I'm telling you that the records show anomalies consistent with entries that were created after the date they purport to carry," Eliza said. "I'm telling you that the physical characteristics of the paper and ink support that reading. And I'm telling you that if an independent examination is done by someone with document experience, those entries will not hold up." Briggs set down his sandwich. He looked at her for a long moment. "Continental Western employs a lot of people in this territory," he said. "I'm aware of that," Eliza said. "The railway coming through Red Willow would bring." "Commissioner Briggs," Eliza said, "I am not asking you to stop the railway from coming through Red Willow. I am asking you to verify that the land they're building on is land they legally obtained. That's a distinction." He looked at her. "You understand," he said, "that if you take this to county court and you're wrong." "I'm not wrong," she said. "You're very confident for someone who—" "For someone who what?" she said, quietly, not aggressively. Just directly. He stopped. "I was going to say, for someone relatively new to this situation," he said. "The documents don't care how long I've been in Red Willow," she said. "The bearing is off by nearly 5 degrees. The federal marker is where my father-in-law said it was. The ledger entries are anomalous. None of that changes based on when I arrived." Briggs was quiet for a moment. "I'll have someone look at the records," he said finally. "I'm not committing to anything else at this stage." "That's all I'm asking at this stage," Eliza said. She left the commissioner's office and sat in the wagon outside and breathed carefully against the tightness in her chest that had been building since the cold morning drive and was now more insistent. She gave herself 2 minutes. Then she drove back to the ranch. Jonah was waiting at the yard gate, and his face told her something had happened while she was gone. "Pike came," she said before he could. "An hour ago," he said. "With Vane." She climbed down from the wagon. "What did they want?" "They made a new offer," Jonah said. He had the flat voice he used when he was angry and containing it. $200 for the disputed section. Said it was generous given the legal uncertainty. $200 for creek land and a potential depot site, Eliza said. "I said no. I know you did," she said. "What else?" He looked at her. "Vane asked where you were," Jonah said. "When I told him you'd gone to the county office, they looked at each other. Then Pike said—" He stopped, cleared his throat. He said that if you continued to pursue this, he'd be forced to raise certain questions about your professional history, and that those questions might be damaging for the family. The air between them was cold and still. He said, "For the family," Eliza said. Those were his words. She stood with that for a moment. The particular ugliness of it, not the threat to her, which she'd expected, but the specific choice to frame it as something that would hurt the children. Pearl, who had tested the quilt. Eli, who had drawn a map from memory and asked if he was helping. Ruth, who was learning, slowly, to let someone else carry some of the weight. Silas, who had offered the chest. "All right," she said. "All right," Jonah said. "I found what I needed this morning," she said. "The commissioner is having someone look at the records. And I have documentation." She looked at the house. "I need to sit down. My chest is—" She stopped. "I'm fine. I just need to sit down." He took her arm, which surprised her enough that she didn't object. They went inside. Ruth had tea ready, not because she'd known what was needed, but because Ruth kept tea ready as a matter of habit. The way you kept certain things close when life had taught you that people came through doors, needing things they weren't going to ask for. Eliza sat at the kitchen table and drank the tea and felt the tightness ease by degrees. They're going to use Vane in court, she said. If it gets to court. You've said that, Jonah said. I want you to understand what that means practically, she said. Vane is credible. He's been in the field for 30 years. He was my supervisor on a federal project, which means anything he says about my work history carries weight that a stranger's accusation wouldn't. He'll testify that the investigation existed. He doesn't have to lie, the investigation did exist. He just leaves out the outcome. You have the outcome, Jonah said. Yes, she said, but in a courtroom, the person who speaks first sets the frame. If he testifies before I produce the clearance documentation, the jury or judge more likely has already built a picture of who I am. Then you need to speak first, Ruth said. Both adults looked at her. Ruth was standing at the stove, not looking at them, stirring something that didn't need stirring. That's what Ma used to say, Ruth said, about arguments. She said if you wait for the other person to finish before you say your side, you're already defending. She said speak first and make them defend. The kitchen was quiet. Your mother was right, Eliza said. She usually was, Ruth said, still stirring. The county hearing was set for 2 weeks out faster than Eliza had expected, which meant Briggs had looked at the records himself and found enough to be concerned. The notice arrived at the ranch by a county messenger on Friday morning in the matter of Continental Western Railway v. Whitaker Land Claim, Eastern Boundary, Pryor County. Jonah read it twice. 2 weeks, Eliza said. That's enough time. For what? For me to request the independent survey of the federal marker, she said. If I file the request through the county commissioner's office today, the court is required to consider it before ruling on Continental Western's claim. They can't dismiss the marker without examining it. Can they delay the hearing? Continental Western's attorneys will certainly try, she said. But if the commissioner has already flagged the ledger anomalies, any delay request from the railway will look like what it is. Jonah put the notice on the table. We need a lawyer, he said. We do, Eliza said. Do you know anyone in Red Willow? Harvey Cross does basic property work, Jonah said. Nothing like this. Nearest real land attorney is in Durango. Durango is 2 days by wagon, Eliza said. I know. Can we afford? We'll manage, Jonah said, which was not a yes and not a no, and communicated everything about where the ranch's finances actually sat. Eliza looked at the table. Write to Durango, she said. Today, explain the situation. Send copies of the deed and my summary of the ledger anomalies. Ask for a consultation by correspondence while I file the independent survey request here. She paused. It won't be ideal, but it's faster than waiting for someone to travel. He wrote the letter that afternoon. Eliza filed the independent survey request at the county office, a formal document citing the federal benchmark coordinates and requesting court-ordered verification before any boundary ruling was issued. Holt took it from her without comment, but she noticed he'd pulled the 1,887 ledger out of the general stack and put it separately on his desk, which meant he was looking at it. She didn't say anything about that. She came back to the ranch and spent the evening preparing what she'd come to think of as the case organizing every document into a sequence that told a story a judge could follow without knowing anything about surveying. The federal marker coordinates, the continental western bearing, the mathematical demonstration of the discrepancy, the ledger anomalies, the receipt log gap, the dates. Pearl found her at the kitchen table at 8 o'clock and climbed into her lap without preamble, which was a thing Pearl had started doing sometime in the second week, and which Eliza had not stopped because she couldn't think of a reason to. What are you doing? Pearl said. Working, Eliza said. On what? Math, Eliza said. Pearl considered this. I don't like math, Pearl said. This kind you might, Eliza said. It's the kind that tells you when someone is lying. Pearl's eyes went wide. Math can tell when someone's lying. If they lie with numbers, yes, Eliza said. Pearl stared at the documents with new respect. Is someone lying? She said. Yes, Eliza said. Who? Some men who want your pa's land. Pearl went very still in the way that small children go still when something has been made concrete that was previously abstract. She'd known, in the vague way of a 6-year-old, that something was happening with the ranch and adults were worried. She hadn't known the specific shape of it. They can't have it, Pearl said. No, Eliza said. They can't. Pearl settled more firmly into her lap, as if adding ballast to the table and everything on it. Eliza went back to her documents. The problem surfaced 8 days before the hearing in the form of a story that appeared in the Pryor County Gazette, the small newspaper that served Red Willow and the surrounding settlements. Eliza read it at the dry goods store, where Martha Fenwick had placed a copy prominently on the counter. The story described the upcoming county hearing and referred to it as a dispute between a major regional employer and a local rancher. It described Continental Western's survey as conducted by experienced professionals. It described Eliza as a recently arrived mail-order bride with no professional credentials who claims surveying experience. It quoted a source unnamed who stated that the claimant's representative had previously been investigated for professional misconduct. It did not mention that the investigation had cleared her. Eliza read it twice. She set it back on the counter. Martha Fenwick was watching her from behind the counter with an expression that wasn't quite satisfaction, the particular alertness of someone who wants to see how a thing lands. That's quite an article, Martha said. It certainly is something, Eliza said evenly. People are talking, Martha said, about whether Jonah's got himself into something he can't handle. She paused, and the pause had a shape, with the situation. The situation, Eliza said. You, Martha said, plainly. People are saying you've gotten Jonah into a court fight he can't win, and that when Continental Western finishes with him, he'll lose more than 400 feet. Eliza looked at Martha Fenwick across the counter. Martha was not a bad woman in any fundamental sense. She was a woman who ran on information and status, who'd built her position in Red Willow on being the person who knew things first, and who found Eliza threatening in a way she probably hadn't articulated even to herself. Martha, Eliza said, do you own your property here? Martha blinked. What? The store, the building. Is it on land you hold a deed to? Of course. Then you might want to pay attention to how this case resolves, Eliza said. Because the survey manipulation I found on Jonah's eastern boundary is the same method. And if Continental Western's right-of-way claims weren't limited to the Whitaker property, she stopped. Let that sit. I'm just saying that the outcome of this hearing affects more people in Red Willow than Jonah. Martha stared at her. I'll take the flower, Eliza said. Please. The hearing was 8 days away when the railway's attorneys filed a motion to postpone, citing inadequate preparation time. The commissioner denied it. 7 days away when Continental Western filed a second motion, this one challenging the independence of the court-appointed surveyor, arguing the surveyor had a conflict of interest because he'd done previous work for Pryor County. The commissioner denied that too. 6 days away when Pike came to the ranch for the last time before the hearing. Eliza was in the yard when he rode in, and she didn't go inside. She stood where she was and waited. He dismounted. He looked at her. I'll make this simple, he said. The company is prepared to offer Whitaker a full deed settlement on the disputed section. Not a purchase, a formal acknowledgement that the western 300 feet are his, confirmed. In exchange, he drops the hearing request and withdraws the independent survey petition. What about the eastern 100 feet? Eliza said. The company retains the eastern section, Pike said. With fair compensation. Fair by whose calculation, Eliza said. Standard market rate for creek land adjacent to a planned depot site, she said. Or for regular pasture. A silence. The offer is fair, Pike said. Take it to Whitaker. He'll say no, Eliza said. You don't know. I know him, she said. It had only been a few weeks, but she found she meant it. He'll say no, because this isn't about the 100 feet. It's about whether a company can file false documents in a county record and face no consequence for it. Pike looked at her. The pleasantness was gone now. Not that it had ever been real, but at least previously it had been present. You understand what will happen at the hearing, he said. Vane will testify. The newspaper has already printed. I read the article, Eliza said. Your credibility will be. Mr. Pike, she said, I have the official clearance documentation from the investigation you're referring to. I have it in my possession, and it will be submitted to the court. I also have a letter written by Jonah's father 30 years ago describing the exact location of the federal marker. which predates your company's existence. I have evidence of 3 anomalous ledger entries in the county records. And I have filed a petition for an independent court survey of a federal boundary marker that your survey documents simply cannot account for." She stopped. "Take the 100 feet," she said, "because if this goes to hearing, you won't keep any of it." Pike stared at her. It was the first time she'd seen something that looked like genuine uncertainty in his face. He mounted his horse. He rode out without another word. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the whole family for once, Silas had stopped avoiding meals in the past week, a change so quiet nobody commented on it. Jonah looked at Eliza and said, "He came with an offer." "Yes," she said, "and you said no. I told him you'd say no." Jonah looked at the table. Pearl was eating with the focused intensity she brought to anything involving food. Eli was watching his father's face. Ruth was watching Eliza. Silas said, "Good, just that, one word," and went back to eating. Jonah looked at his son, then at Eliza. Something moved in his expression that was hard to name and that she didn't try to. 2 days, she said. 2 days, he said. Eli looked up. "I can come?" "No," Jonah and Eliza said at the same time. Eli slumped. "Can I at least tell people?" he said. "Tell people what?" Eliza said. "That I found the marker." "I found it first. I told you about the iron thing in the ground, and that was Danny Mercer is going to be so." "Eli," Jonah said. "Yeah, after the hearing," Jonah said. "You can tell anyone you want after the hearing." Eli sat up again, already composing what he would say to Danny Mercer. Eliza looked at the family around the table, Pearl eating, Eli planning, Ruth watching, Silas present in a way he hadn't been 3 weeks ago, and felt the weight of what sat 2 days ahead, and also, strangely, the weight of what already sat here, in this kitchen, around this table. She went to bed that night with her documents organized and her arguments sequenced, and her evidence prepared as well as she could prepare it, and lay in the dark for a while before she slept. The letter from the Durango attorney had arrived that afternoon. He'd reviewed her summary and the deed copies and written back 12 pages of notes, dense and technical, and exactly what she needed, and his final line was, "Your survey analysis is sound. The marker documentation, if it holds, should be determinative. Don't let them rattle you on the stand. Don't let them rattle you on the stand." She looked at the ceiling. She thought about Augustus Vane, and what he might say, and what she would say after, and whether the judge would be the kind of man who decided based on evidence, or based on who seemed more like someone he should believe. She didn't know the answer to that last part. She wouldn't know until she was in the room. She closed her eyes. 2 days. The morning of the hearing, Eliza woke at 4 and didn't try to go back to sleep. She dressed in the dark, methodically, choosing the one good dress she owned. Not her best, because she didn't have a best, but the one that was least worn at the cuffs and that sat properly on her shoulders. She braided her hair twice, because the first attempt was uneven, and she wanted her hands to be steady before she walked into that courtroom. She was not going to walk in looking like someone who had spent the night afraid, even if that was precisely what she'd done. She went downstairs. Jonah was already at the stove. He looked up when she came in, registered the dress, registered her face, and turned back to the coffee without saying anything that would require her to respond to it. That was the right instinct, and she appreciated it. She sat down and accepted the coffee, and they sat in the kitchen in the 4 o'clock dark, the way people sit when they've run out of preparation. And the only thing left is the thing itself. "The Durango attorney's notes," she said. "I went through them again last night. There's a procedural point he flagged. If Continental Western's attorneys try to introduce Vane's testimony before I've presented the survey evidence, I need to object on the grounds that character testimony is inadmissible before the substantive technical record is established." "You know how to do that?" Jonah said. "In a courtroom?" "I know what needs to happen," she said. "Whether the judge lets me is a different question." "Harvey Cross is coming," Jonah said. "He's not a land attorney, but he knows procedure. He can object if you can't." "I know." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I'm not going to let them go first on Vane. That's the main thing." Jonah looked at her. "Eliza," he said. She looked up. "Whatever happens today," he said, "whatever they say in that courtroom about you, I need you to know that it doesn't change anything. Here, at the ranch." She looked at him for a long moment. "You don't know what they might say," she said. "Doesn't matter what they say," he said. I've watched you for 3 weeks. I know what I've seen. It was not a speech. He wasn't a man who made speeches. It was just the flat, quiet statement of a person who had made a decision and was telling her about it, and it hit her somewhere below the ribs in a way she hadn't been ready for. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. Just win. The Pryor County Courthouse was a 2-story stone building at the center of Red Willow that served as courthouse, commissioner's office, and occasional meeting hall, depending on what the territory needed from it on any given week. By the time Jonah and Eliza arrived, there were already people gathered outside more than she'd expected. Their word had traveled. The railway dispute had been building in the town's consciousness for weeks, and the newspaper article had sharpened it into something people felt they needed to witness. Martha Fenwick was there, positioned near the front steps with 2 other women, and she looked at Eliza with an expression that had shifted since the storeless, comfortable superiority. More something cautious and watchful that suggested Eliza's comment about property deeds had done some work in the intervening days. Harvey Cross was waiting just inside the door, a small, neat man of 50 who handled wills and property transfers and looked perpetually like he'd rather be somewhere quieter. He shook Jonah's hand, shook Eliza's hand, and immediately looked at the stack of documents she was carrying. All of this, he said. All of it organized by argument sequence, she said. The independent survey request and the commissioner's response are on top. The ledger anomaly documentation is 3rd. The federal marker evidence is 4th through 7th. My clearance documentation is in the separate folder. Don't let it mix with the survey materials. He looked at the separate folder. The investigation, he said. Cleared, she said. Completely. But keep it separate because I want to control when it enters the record. He nodded with the air of someone who had just realized the woman in front of him had a cleaner legal strategy than he'd been expecting. All right, he said. Let's go in. The courtroom was already more than half full when they took their seats, at the respondent's table, Continental Western being the petitioner, as they'd filed the original claim. The railway's legal team occupied the petitioner's table with the practiced ease of men who spent most of their professional lives in courtrooms. 3 attorneys, all from Denver by the look of their suits. Documents stacked with institutional precision. A man at the end of the table whom Eliza recognized, without looking directly at him, as Augustus Vane. She set her documents down and arranged them in the sequence she'd planned, and did not look at Vane. Judge Harlan Morrow was 62, had been a federal territorial judge before taking the county position, and had a face that gave nothing away and eyes that gave quite a lot. He came in without ceremony, sat, looked at both tables, and said, "Let's get to it." Continental Western's lead attorney was a man named Clarence Dodd Polished, unhurried, with the confident vocal pacing of someone who had practiced in front of judges for long enough to know exactly how much space to take without triggering impatience. He opened by presenting the railway's position, a legitimate survey conducted by licensed professionals, county-recorded documents establishing the boundary, and a straightforward property claim that had been complicated by a landowner through his representative unwilling to accept the legal reality of the situation. He used the phrase legal reality 4 times in 12 minutes. He referenced the county records. He referenced the professional surveyors. He did not yet mention Eliza by name. He was saving that. Harvey Cross made the opening for the respondent's side, which was competent and procedurally sound and somewhat less compelling than Dodd's, mostly because Cross was nervous in a way he was working to conceal and not entirely succeeding. But he got through the key points: the deed, the federal marker petition, the independent survey request the commissioner had already granted. That last piece landed visibly. Dodd's expression didn't change, but one of his associate attorneys wrote something quickly on a notepad. Then Dodd called his first witness, not Vane. The first witness was one of the Continental Western surveyors, a man named Terrence Gould, who had the specific confidence of a licensed professional being asked to explain his work to people he assumed couldn't follow it. He walked through the survey measurements with practiced precision, describing instruments, methods, bearings. Eliza listened. She wrote notes. She wrote 3 notes in particular, each flagged with a small mark at the margin. When Cross was given the opportunity to cross-examine, he started to ask a general question about survey methods, but Eliza leaned over and quietly said, "The benchmark reference." Ask him which federal benchmark station he used to establish his primary control point. Cross looked at her. Ask him, she said. Exactly that. Cross asked. Gould named a station. Eliza wrote it down. It was not the station referenced in the 1,851 survey records. It was a station that had been established in 1,873, post-dating the Whitaker deed by 2 decades, which meant Gould had calibrated his survey against a reference point that didn't exist when the original land claim was filed, rather than against the original federal infrastructure. That wasn't necessarily fraud by itself, but it was exactly the kind of technical omission that created the appearance of consistency while producing a fundamentally different result. She wrote 4 lines of notes and underlined the station name twice. Gould stepped down. Dodd called Vane. Augustus Vane took the stand with the deliberate pace of a man who'd been in this position before and had decided what he was going to say. He was 60, lean, with a gray beard and careful eyes, and he spoke with the kind of measured credibility that came from decades of technical work. He looked at the judge when he answered, not at the attorneys, which was the choice of someone who understood where the real audience was. Dodd took him through his credentials, first 30 years, federal work, multi-state experience, and then asked him to describe his professional familiarity with Eliza Marlowe. Eliza sat still. She worked on a federal survey project I supervised, Vane said. About 8 years ago. She was skilled. There's no question about her technical ability. Eliza had not expected that. Neither, she thought, had Dodd, because he moved to his next questions slightly faster than he'd been pacing, which meant Vane had departed from the script. And during that project, Dodd said, there was a professional matter involving Miss Marlowe? There was an investigation, Vane said. Can you describe the nature of that investigation? There were questions, Vane said slowly, about whether certain field measurements had been accurately recorded. An allegation was made that some records may have been altered. Who made that allegation? Dodd said, a pause. I did, Vane said. And the basis for your allegation? The records appeared inconsistent with the field conditions I'd observed, Vane said. I was the supervising surveyor. It was my responsibility to report it. And the outcome of that investigation? Vane was quiet for a moment. She was cleared, he said. The courtroom had been following this, with the attentive quiet of people watching something they didn't fully understand, but sensed was important. At those words, she was cleared, there was a small shift in the room. Not dramatic, just a collective recalibration. Dodd moved on smoothly, asking Vane about the Continental Western Survey methodology, which was what he'd actually brought Vane here to address. But the damage to the opening he'd planned was done. Vane had answered the question before it was fully asked, and he'd answered it honestly. Eliza looked at Vane. He was looking at the judge. She didn't know what had happened in the conversation between Vane and Pike, between Wednesday and today. She didn't know what Vane had been asked to do, or what he'd decided he wouldn't. She might never know. But the man on the stand was not the witness Pike had brought him here to be. Cross-examined Vane briefly, establishing the clearance documentation on the record, then sat. Dodd stood for redirect. Mr. Vane, he said, regardless of the investigation outcome, would you say that Miss Marlowe's experience level qualifies her to conduct an independent assessment of a professional survey? She's not a licensed surveyor, Vane said, so her analysis would depend on the quality of the evidence she examined, Vane said. Not her license status. Technical accuracy doesn't require a license. It requires understanding the mathematics and access to the source data. He paused. From what I understand of what she's found, she's working from primary documents. That's the right methodology. Another pause in the room. Dodd's redirect was not going the way he'd planned. He thanked Vane and sat down. Vane stepped down. He walked past the respondent's table and did not look at Eliza, but his pace slowed fractionally, almost imperceptibly, for one step. She didn't know what that meant. She filed it away. Judge Morrow called a midday recess. In the hallway outside, while Jonah talked in low tones with Harvey Cross, Eliza stood near a window and ate half of the biscuit Ruth had wrapped and put in her coat pocket that morning, and breathed and thought about the afternoon. Dodd would push harder after the recess. He'd lost the Vane opening, which meant he'd come back to the survey methodology and try to bury her evidence in technical objections. He'd argue that a non-licensed analysis was inadmissible. He'd argue that the ledger anomalies were clerical errors rather than fraud. He'd argue that the federal marker, even if valid, predated modern survey standards and couldn't be considered determinative. She needed the independent survey results to be read into the record. The court appointed surveyor a man named Philip Adler from the county seat had completed his examination of the eastern marker 3 days earlier and submitted his findings to the court. She didn't know what he'd found. She'd filed the petition. She'd given him the coordinates. She'd described the methodology, and then she'd waited because she couldn't be present for his examination and couldn't influence his findings. She would find out when the judge read the report. That was the part she couldn't control. Jonah appeared at her elbow. "How do you think it's going?" he said. "Vane didn't do what Pike wanted him to do," she said. "I noticed that." "The afternoon is the critical part," she said. "When Adler's survey results come in, do you know what they'll say?" "I know what they should say," she said. "If the marker is where I calculated it is, and if Adler read the coordinates correctly, they'll say the eastern boundary is approximately 400 feet east of where Continental Western placed it. And if they don't say that?" She looked at him. "Then we have a different problem," she said. He nodded. He handed her the other half of the biscuit. "Ruth sent enough for both of us," he said. "Eat it." She ate it. The afternoon session began with Dodd filing a formal objection to Eliza's survey analysis being entered into evidence on the grounds of non-licensure. The judge heard it, asked Harvey Cross to respond, heard Cross's response, which was competent, and then asked Eliza directly, "Miss Marlowe, do you wish to address the qualifications question yourself?" She stood. "Your Honor, the objection conflates license status with analytical competency. A license certifies that someone has met the requirements to conduct original field surveys. It does not speak to whether a person with 7 years of professional field experience, working directly under licensed surveyors, can accurately read and mathematically analyze an existing survey document. The evidence I'm presenting is not an original survey. It's a mathematical analysis of a discrepancy in an existing survey supported by primary historical documents. The mathematics either hold or they don't. I'm asking the court to evaluate the mathematics." The courtroom was quiet. Judge Morrow looked at her for a moment. "Objection overruled," he said. "The evidence will be admitted. The weight given to the analysis is a matter for this court to determine." She sat. Harvey Cross exhaled quietly. She presented the evidence in sequence the way she'd planned it. The federal marker coordinates from Jonah's father's survey notes and the letters she'd found in Clara's ledger. The 1,851 placement records. The mathematical demonstration of the bearing discrepancy, she'd written it out in a form that a non-mathematician could follow, step by step, each calculation visible. And she walked through it slowly enough that the judge could read along with his own copy. She presented the Eli notation without naming him, a witness with direct knowledge of the marker's physical location, confirmed during a site visit, and described what they'd found on the limestone shelf. Dodd objected twice during her presentation, and both times the judge overruled. Then she presented the ledger anomalies. This was the section she'd been most uncertain about, because document forensics was outside her core expertise, and she'd had to rely on what she could observe rather than what she could technically certify. She presented it, carefully describing the paper characteristics, the ink density, the sequence logic, and was explicit about what she could establish directly versus what she was inferring. Dodd objected that her analysis of the ledger documents was speculative. Judge Morrow did not immediately overrule this one. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "you're not a document examiner." "No, Your Honor," she said. "I'm presenting the observable characteristics as described in my notes taken at the time of examination. I'm not asking the court to accept my interpretations as expert testimony. I'm asking the court to look at the documents themselves and consider whether the sequence is consistent with the dates they carry." "You're asking the court to draw its own inference," Morrow said. "Yes," she said, "from the primary evidence." He looked at her for a moment. "Objection sustained in part," he said. "The documents themselves are admitted. Miss Marlowe's interpretive analysis will be treated as lay observation rather than expert testimony. It was not everything she'd wanted, but the documents were in." Dodd's cross-examination of her was thorough and well-prepared. He went after the benchmark station discrepancy she'd flagged in Gould's testimony, tried to establish that using a 1,873 station was standard practice, and created no meaningful inconsistency within 1,851 deed. She held her position. The original deed referenced the original federal infrastructure, and calibrating against later station introduced a systematic error that compounded over the boundary length. He went after the bearing calculation tried to get her to admit that field surveys had acceptable margins of error that could account for the discrepancies she'd identified. She agreed that field surveys had error margins. She disagreed that standard error margins could account for a consistent 4 to 5 degree deviation that benefited the railway across the entire disputed boundary. A random error, she said, distributes randomly. This error distributes consistently in one direction. That's not error, that's choice. Dodd looked at her. That's a serious accusation, he said. It's a mathematical description, she said. The accusation is implicit in the mathematics. He moved on. He did not raise the investigation, not once after Vane's testimony. She didn't know whether he'd decided it was no longer useful, or whether Vane's early disclosure had made it counterproductive. Either way, it didn't come. When Dodd sat, Judge Morrow looked at the clock, then at both tables, and said, "The independent survey report." He opened a document on his bench, the report filed by Philip Adler, the court-appointed surveyor. The courtroom became very still. Morrow read. He read for a long time longer than Eliza had expected, and his face gave nothing away in the reading, which was the particular discipline of a man who'd been doing this for 30 years. Then he set the report down. Mr. Adler's survey, he said, located the federal benchmark monument at coordinates consistent with the 1,851 placement records entered by the respondent. The monument's position, relative to the continental Western Survey baseline, places the eastern boundary of the Whitaker property approximately 392 feet east of the boundary claimed in Continental Western's filing. The room erupted, not dramatically, not the way it happened in stories with shouting and chaos. Just a sudden collective release of held breath and murmured voices, and the sound of people turning to each other. And, somewhere behind Eliza, Jonah exhaled so completely that she heard it as clearly as anything else in the room. Dodd was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, a single field survey cannot be considered." Mr. Dodd, Morrow said, "The survey was commissioned by this court. Its methodology is not before us for argument. The monuments condition its integrity as a measurement reference is addressed in the report," Morrow said. Mr. Adler describes the monument as intact, undisturbed, and consistent with mid-19th century federal placement standards. Dodd sat, but he sat forward, with the posture of a man who still had cards and was deciding which one to play. "Your Honor," he said, "even if the monument's position is accepted, the question of the county records." "The county records," Morrow said, "are a matter I intend to address separately from this ruling. Commissioner Briggs has brought certain anomalies to my attention that require independent examination." He looked at Dodd. "That examination will proceed regardless of the outcome of this hearing." Dodd said nothing. In the silence, Eliza heard something shift. Not in the room in the case itself. The moment when something that had been contested became settled. You could feel it sometimes, not always, but sometimes the weight of it changing. Judge Morrow ruled at 4:15 in the afternoon. Continental Western's claim to the disputed eastern section was dismissed. The Whitaker eastern boundary was confirmed at the location established by the 1,851 federal monument. The independent survey report was entered as determinative evidence. The county records anomalies were referred for separate investigation by the territorial court. And at the end of the ruling, almost as an aside, the judge said, "This court notes that the evidence presented by the respondent's representative demonstrates a quality of analytical work that reflects considerable professional competence. The absence of formal licensure does not diminish the accuracy of that work, which this court finds persuasive." Harvey Cross put his pen down. Jonah stood. Eliza sat for a moment at the respondent's table, with her documents still in front of her, very carefully not doing anything dramatic. Because if she stood up too fast, she was going to do something embarrassing, in front of the entire town of Red Willow, and she was not going to do that. She stood slowly. She picked up her documents. She turned. The room was full of people she'd seen at the train station 3 weeks ago, the same people who'd watched her step off that train and whispered. Martha Fenwick was near the back, and she was not whispering, and she was not looking at Eliza with the expression she'd had at the dry goods store. She was looking at her with something that had no name exactly, but that contained something that might eventually become respect. Jonah was at her side. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, just a touch, brief and unannounced, and then it was gone, and they were walking toward the door. Outside the courthouse, in the late afternoon cold, 3 neighbors stopped Jonah before they'd crossed the steps. Men she'd seen at the Edge of Things ranchers who'd been watching without committing. One of them, a man named Cutler, shook Jonah's hand and then looked at Eliza. "My boundary with the Morrison property," he said. "I've always thought the line was wrong. Surveyed in 1884 by a company man, not federal. Would you—" He stopped. "Could someone with your experience look at it?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I can look at it." He nodded. He walked away. Then a second man approached. Same question, different property. Then a woman older, alone, who said she'd been arguing with the land office about a filing for 4 years and didn't know if there was anything to find. But would Eliza please just look? Jonah stood beside her through all of it, with the expression of a man watching something unfold that he hadn't predicted and didn't know how to characterize. When they reached the wagon, Harvey Cross appeared beside them. "You did well in there," he said to Eliza, "better than I expected." "I mean that as a compliment." "I know," she said. "The territorial investigation into the records," he said. "That's going to go wider than this case. If they find what I think they'll find." "Other properties," Jonah said. "Other properties," Cross said. "Other families. This may have been going on for years." The 3 of them stood with that. "Pike," Jonah said. "Pike's filings are all connected," Cross said. "When the territorial investigation pulls on those threads," he shook his head, "he won't keep his position. And Continental Western is going to have a significant problem with the Federal Territorial Office." Eliza thought about Pike's face when he'd ridden out of the yard 2 nights ago. The first time she'd seen real uncertainty in him. She wondered if he'd known then how thin the ice was, or if he'd believed, the way men like him usually believed, that the institution behind him was too large to fall. "Does Adler the surveyor, will he be involved in the territorial investigation?" she asked Cross. "Almost certainly," Cross said. "He should contact the families first," she said. "Before the investigators do, so they're not frightened by the process. So they know what's happening and what it means for their land." Cross looked at her. "That's not a standard legal." "I know," she said. "It's practical. Frightened people make bad decisions. If they understand what the investigation is looking for, before the first official appears at their door, they'll cooperate. If they don't understand, they'll resist." Cross was quiet for a moment. "I'll mention it to Briggs," he said. He left. Jonah untied the horses. They drove out of Red Willow in the early evening, and the road was cold and the light was going, and neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes, which was the right amount of time. Then Jonah said, "You were right." "About which part?" she said. "About the bearing," he said. "About the ledger. About Vane. About all of it." "The mathematics were right," she said. "I just read them." "Don't do that," he said. "Do what?" "Shrink it," he said. "You spent 3 weeks, sick, in a house you'd been in for 4 days, taking on a railway company with a document case that nobody else in Red Willow was willing to build. Don't shrink that into the mathematics were right." She looked at the road ahead. "I'm not used to being told I did something well," she said. "Not fishing for more, just naming a fact." "Get used to it," he said. "You're going to be here a while." She looked at him. He was watching the road, not her. She looked back at the road. The ranch appeared at the end of the drive in the last of the light, the familiar outline of the house, the barn, the eastern pasture beyond it, the ridge just visible at the edge of the sky. All 4 children were on the porch. Pearl came down the steps at a run and hit Eliza at approximately knee height, which was where her enthusiasm generally landed. Eli was trying to look casual and failing because he wanted to know everything and couldn't pretend he didn't. Ruth was on the second step, with her arms crossed and her eyes doing the work of asking the question. Silas was at the top of the porch, leaning against the post, and he looked at his father and then at Eliza with the particular focus he'd been turning on things for 3 weeks. The look that didn't give much, but that missed nothing. "Well," he said. "We won," Jonah said. Eli shouted something that wasn't quite a word. Pearl had already begun telling Eliza about what they'd had for supper, in the assumption that the crisis being over meant they could return to normal conversation. Ruth's arms came uncrossed, and Silas turned and went back inside, because that was who he was. But through the kitchen window, Eliza could see him a moment later, standing at the stove, and the set of his shoulders had changed. She stood in the yard in the cold, with Pearl holding her hand and Eli talking about Danny Mercer, and she looked at the house, with the light in the windows and the smoke from the stove, and she thought about the letter she'd found in Clara's ledger. "I want someone to know where it is in case I'm not here to say." And she thought about how the thing you protect isn't always the thing you think you're protecting. She'd come here with one suitcase and a desperate advertisement and lungs that still weren't right. She had protected a man's ranch. She had exposed something that would give back land to people who didn't yet know it had been taken. And standing in the yard in the last light, she understood that the thing she had also protected quietly, without naming it, without planning to was the particular and fragile shape of this family, which had been broken in one way and was now slowly becoming something new. Not the same, never the same, but new in a way that had room in it for everyone who was there now. Pearl pulled her toward the house. She went. The winter after the hearing was the hardest one the territory had seen in 6 years. Snow came in November and didn't stop being serious about itself until March, and the ranch work expanded into the kind of relentless physical demand that left no space for thinking about anything except what needed doing next. Pipes froze. A section of the barn roof needed shoring up before a heavy snow load brought it down. 2 of the horses got sick in January and required more attention than any of them had time to give, but they gave it anyway because that was the only option. Eliza's lungs gave her 2 bad weeks in February. She didn't tell Jonah how bad, but Ruth knew, because Ruth noticed everything, and Ruth started leaving hot tea outside her door at night without being asked and without making it a conversation. She was not yet entirely well. That winter made clear what she'd been trying to ignore since October, that recovery from what she'd had was not a straight line, and that pushing through the hearing on adrenaline and necessity had borrowed against something she was still paying back. She rested when she could. She worked when she couldn't rest. She did not complain, which was both a strength and a stubbornness, and Jonah called her on it exactly once. "You're not required to pretend you're fine," he said. "I'm not pretending," she said. "Eliza, I'm managing," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her, with the flat patience he used when he'd decided not to argue something but hadn't conceded it either. "All right," he said, "but managing doesn't mean doing it alone." She didn't answer that directly. But the next week, when the February cold hit her lungs again, she told him. That was something. The territorial investigation into continental Western survey practices formally began in December, 6 weeks after the hearing. Commissioner Briggs had sent the ledger anomaly documentation to the territorial court, and what the investigators found when they pulled the full thread was worse than Eliza had estimated and more systematic than even Pike probably understood when he'd started it. 7 properties in Pryor County, 4 in the adjacent county to the east. Boundary manipulations going back at least 4 years, all following the same pattern survey bearings, shifted in ways that moved productive water-adjacent land into the railway's right-of-way claims, supported by county records that had been quietly amended to appear consistent with the railway's measurements. Pike hadn't invented the method. That was the thing that surprised people when it came out. He'd inherited it from a predecessor who'd been doing it in Wyoming Territory, and he'd brought it to Colorado because it had worked there without anyone catching it. It had worked here too, until Eliza sat down at a kitchen table with a candle and an old set of survey notes and did arithmetic at midnight. Bramwell Pike was removed from his position in January, pending the territorial investigation's formal findings. He left Red Willow quietly, which surprised some people and didn't surprise Eliza. Men like Pike rarely made dramatic exits. They withdrew and waited to see which way the wind settled and planned their next move from somewhere less exposed. She didn't know what happened to him after that and didn't spend much time thinking about it. He had stopped being the point of the story. The point was the 7 families. Harvey Cross contacted her in December to say that the territorial investigators were moving through the disputed properties, and that her original analysis documents the bearing calculations. The ledger sequence evidence were being used as the framework for identifying similar manipulations in the other cases. He said it in the careful way of a lawyer who didn't want to overstate something, but what he was telling her, under the careful language, was that the work she'd done at the Whitaker kitchen table was now doing work for people she'd never met. She thought about that on a cold December evening while she was helping Eli with mathematics, homework, real mathematics, not the kitchen table variety, fractions and basic geometry, and Eli looked up from his slate and said, "Are you thinking about the other ranches?" "How did you know that?" she said. "You get a face," he said. "What kind of face?" He demonstrated. It was a reasonable approximation of her concentrating, and also faintly funny, and she laughed, which made him grin with the specific satisfaction of a child who has made an adult laugh unexpectedly. "Yes," she said. "I was thinking about the other ranches." "Will they get their land back?" he said. "Some of them," she said. "The ones where the marker evidence is strong. The others," she stopped. "It's harder when there isn't a physical reference point. When the only evidence is the document anomaly. But you found those too," he said. "The ledger things. The ledger evidence establishes that something was wrong," she said. "It doesn't always establish exactly where the correct boundary was. Those families may get compensation instead of the land itself." Eli was quiet, processing this with the serious consideration he brought to things he found genuinely unfair. "That's not the same," he said. "No," she said, "it's not." Is that okay? That some of them don't get the land back?" She looked at him. He was 9 years old, almost 10, and he was asking a real question, not a rhetorical one. He wanted to know what she actually thought. "It's not okay in the sense that it's right," she said carefully. "But it's what's possible given what the evidence can establish. Sometimes the best outcome available isn't the right outcome, it's just the best one you can get." She paused. "That's an unsatisfying answer." "Yeah," Eli said. He went back to his slate. "Then, but you got ours back." "We got yours back," she said. He looked up. "You," he said. Firmly, not unkindly, just correcting a fact he found inaccurately stated. She looked at the fraction he'd been working on. "Your denominator is wrong," she said. He looked at it. He erased. He tried again. Outside the window, the January snow was doing what January snow did in Colorado Territory, which was commit to itself completely, and the house was warm from the stove. And somewhere upstairs, Pearl was singing something tuneless and confident, which was her preferred approach to singing. The wedding happened in April. It was not a large wedding, because they had not planned a large wedding. Jonah had asked her in February, in the kitchen, in the way he asked most things plainly and without embellishment. "I think we should make this official," he said. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. "Good," he said, and went back to his coffee. She had thought about that exchange later and decided it was exactly right. There was no performance in it, no theater. It was 2 people who had been living alongside each other through a hard winter and a harder fight and had arrived at a point where the arrangement they'd been careful not to name had become something that had a name, and naming it was the next practical step. The children knew before it was formally announced, which was inevitable given that they all lived in the same house. Pearl received the news with the satisfaction of someone who had already assumed this was going to happen and was pleased to be confirmed. Eli asked if this meant he could introduce Eliza as his mother to Danny Mercer, and Eliza said he could introduce her, however felt right to him, and he announced the next day at school that his mother had won a case against a railway company, which was the introduction he'd apparently been waiting to make. Ruth said nothing immediately. She processed it the way she processed most things, quietly and thoroughly, and then came to Eliza 2 days later, while Eliza was mending a shirt, and sat down and said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," Eliza said. "Ma's things," Ruth said. "Her household books, the things in the chest." "I don't want," she stopped. "I don't want them put away somewhere." "They're not going anywhere," Eliza said. "She was here first," Ruth said. "Not accusatory, just a statement of a thing that mattered to her." "I know," Eliza said, "and she'll have been here first for the rest of your life. That doesn't go away because something new happens." The two things aren't in competition. Ruth was quiet. She kept good records, Eliza said. Her household books. I've looked at them. She was meticulous. And her letter about the survey marker, your grandfather's letter. That's the reason we found it in time. She kept it when she didn't have to. Ruth looked up. What letter? She said. Eliza had not mentioned this to anyone. She'd used the information and let the source stay in the chest. She told Ruth about the folded paper in the back of the third household ledger. Jonah's father's handwriting, the description of where he'd placed the marker, the sentence, I want someone to know where it is, in case I'm not here to say. Ruth sat very still. She kept it, Ruth said, for years, Eliza said. She didn't know what it was for. She just kept it because it was his, and it was in the book, and she didn't throw away things that might matter. Ruth looked at the mending in Eliza's hands. She would have liked you, Ruth said. It came out carefully, like something she'd measured before saying. I hope so, Eliza said. She didn't like people who pretended, Ruth said. She always said you could tell what a person was actually like when things went wrong. That's when they stopped performing. She paused. You never performed. Not even when you first got here and everyone was watching. Eliza thought about the train platform, Martha Fenwick's voice carrying across the crowd, the walk to the wagon with her one suitcase. I didn't have the energy for performing, she said honestly. Ruth almost smiled. Maybe that's the same thing, she said. Silas was harder. He was always harder, and she didn't expect that to change, and she had stopped wanting it to. What she wanted was what she'd been slowly getting, his presence at the table, his occasional question that was really a test, his willingness to be in the same room without the careful architecture of distance he'd maintained in October. He came to her a week before the wedding with a posture that meant he'd been preparing what he wanted to say. I know you're not replacing her, he said. I know you know that, she said. I just wanted to say it, he said. So it was said. All right, she said, it's said. He looked at the floor, then at her. He stopped, started again. She was good at finding things that needed doing and doing them before anyone asked. She said waiting to be asked meant the thing usually went too long undone. He paused. You do that too. That's all, he said. He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he went out. From Silas, that was a great deal. She understood that. She filed it in the same place. She'd filed his offer of the chest in October, the place that held things that mattered and that didn't need to be spoken about to be real. The ceremony was small. Harvey Cross witnessed. 3 neighboring ranchers came, including Cutler, whose boundary she'd examined in December, and whose survey anomaly had turned out to be genuine, not Continental Western's work, an older one, different company, same method, and she'd written the analysis that Cross had submitted to the Territorial Claims Office. Cutler's land hadn't been fully resolved yet, but it was in process, and when he shook her hand after the ceremony, his grip was the kind that conveyed something beyond courtesy. Martha Fenwick came. That was the surprise. She arrived without her usual companions, which was itself a statement, and she brought a jar of preserved plums that were clearly from her own pantry. And she handed them to Eliza with an expression that was not comfortable and that didn't pretend to be. I owe you an apology, Martha said, for what I said at the train station, and other things. Eliza looked at her. You thought you knew what I was, Eliza said. I thought I knew what you weren't, Martha said. There's a difference, and I was still wrong. Eliza took the plums. Thank you for coming, she said. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't the absence of it. It was 2 women standing in the fact of how things had actually gone, and acknowledging it, and moving forward, which was the most practical form of resolution Eliza knew. The spring was better than the winter in the specific way that springs always were after difficult winters. Not because anything was easy, but because the difficulty was different, was outward-facing, was the difficulty of growing things rather than preserving them. The eastern pasture went back to its proper use. Jonah moved the fence line to where it should have been, and the creek ran through Whitaker land the way it had always been meant to, and Eli stood at the new fence line and pointed out the flat rock on the limestone shelf with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who had contributed to history. Danny Mercer was with him and was very impressed. Eliza taught through the spring. Not formally. She had no classroom and no appointment. She taught the way things get taught in households through proximity, through answering questions, through the slow accumulation of small lessons that don't feel like lessons until later. Silas wanted to understand the mathematics of surveying, not the theory, but the actual methodology. How you translated a bearing and a distance into a point on the earth, how you built a picture of land from numbers. She taught him. He learned fast and asked good questions, and corrected her once accurately on a trigonometry step she'd talked through too quickly, and she told him he was right and showed him why. And the look on his face in that moment was something she would keep. Eli wanted to understand why numbers could reveal lies. Every measurement is a claim, she told him. You're claiming that something is a certain distance, a certain angle, a certain size. When you record it, you're making a permanent claim. If the claim is wrong, whether because you made a mistake or because you chose to make it wrong, the error becomes part of the record. And records get built on top of other records. So one wrong number can spread, Eli said. One wrong number that someone trusts can spread, she said. That's why you measure honestly. Because the person who uses your record doesn't know what the ground looked like when you stood on it. They only know what you wrote down. Eli was quiet, working through this. That's kind of scary, he said. It's kind of a responsibility, she said. He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. She watched him think about it, the way you could see ideas taking up residence in a child's mind, settling in, finding corners, becoming part of how they looked at things. Measure honestly, because somebody's future may depend upon the line you draw. She hadn't said it in those exact words, but that was what she meant, and she thought he understood it. By summer, 4 of the 7 affected properties in Pryor County had been formally resurveyed and their boundaries corrected. 2 of the 4 required Continental Western to relocate planned infrastructure, not a full retreat, but a renegotiation, conducted under territorial oversight and on terms that the affected ranchers actually understood now, because several of them had come to Eliza first, and she'd explained what they were looking at. That was the thing she hadn't expected, the way the work kept expanding. Cutler sent a neighbor. The neighbor sent his brother-in-law. A woman from the eastern part of the county came with a deed that was 20 years old and a grievance she'd been unable to articulate for 3 of them. And Eliza sat with her for 2 hours and went through the documents and found 2 things wrong, and 1 thing that wasn't wrong but that the woman had misread, and she explained the difference. She was not getting paid for any of this. Jonah raised that point in August. People are coming from 40 miles, he said. You're spending 2-3 days a week on other people's property questions. I know, she said. That's a service, he said. That has value. I know that too, she said. Are you going to? I don't know yet, she said. I'm thinking about how it would work. There's no legal framework for someone unlicensed to provide formal survey analysis for compensation. Harvey Cross thinks there may be a way to structure it as consulting, but it would require, she stopped. It would require me to sit the licensing examination. Jonah was quiet. Could you pass it? He said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. Probably. It's been years since I worked at that level formally, but the underlying yes. I think so. Then do it, he said. It's a significant undertaking, she said. The examination is in Denver. The preparation would take months. And I'm not sure the territory will accept a woman candidate with ounce. Eliza, he said. She stopped. Do you want to do it, he said. She thought about sitting at that kitchen table in October with a candle and survey notes. She thought about the county office and the ledgers, and the way numbers told the truth when the people recording them had decided not to. She thought about the woman from the eastern county, 3 years of a grievance she couldn't articulate, and the particular relief on her face when something abstract became specific and addressable. Yes, she said. Then figure out what it takes and do it, he said. The ranch is stable. We'll manage the time. She looked at him. He was not a demonstrative man. He didn't make speeches or declarations. He offered practical support in plain language and expected that to communicate what it communicated. It did. I'll write to the territorial office next week, she said. Write tomorrow, he said. Next week is too easy to push to the week after. She wrote the next day. The response from the territorial office took 6 weeks and was, as she'd anticipated, complicated. There was no precedent for a female candidate for survey licensure in Colorado Territory. This was stated in the letter not as a refusal, but as a procedural uncertainty. We aren't sure how to process. This rather than an outright no, which was a different kind of obstacle and one she'd learned to work with. She wrote back. She documented her experience. She included the letters from the territorial investigation that referenced her analysis work. She included Judge Morrow's comment from the hearing, record considerable professional competence, because if she was going to use that comment, it might as well be in the right place. Harvey Cross helped her frame the procedural argument. The licensing examination tested competence, not sex. If the examination was the standard, she was prepared to meet it. The process should not be different because the candidate was. It took 4 months. The examination date was granted for the following spring. She prepared through the fall and winter with the focused patience of someone who had learned, over the past year, that most things worth doing required more time than felt reasonable and less perfection than felt necessary. She worked through the technical material. She asked Silas to quiz her on trigonometry, which he did with a thoroughness that suggested he was also studying, which was not a coincidence. Pearl helped her make flashcards, which was less academically useful, but which Pearl found very satisfying. Ruth made sure she ate. Jonah checked in every few weeks in the way he checked in on things obliquely, through adjacent questions, asking how the preparation was going in the same tone he used to ask how the livestock were doing, which was, she'd come to understand, his form of sustained attention. She passed the examination in April. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, and she read it at the kitchen table, and Jonah watched her face while she read and knew before she said anything. She set the letter down. Well, she said. Well, he said. Pearl grabbed the letter and studied it with 4-year-old, 6-year-old seriousness before announcing that the writing was very small. Eli read it over Pearl's shoulder and pumped his fist in a way that sent coffee sloshing. Ruth read it carefully and said, "It should have said this a year ago." Silas read it last, standing at the edge of the kitchen, and looked at her over the paper. "Now you can charge people," he said. "That's your first thought?" she said. "You've been working for free for 6 months," he said. "Now you don't have to." She looked at him for a moment. "You sound like your father," she said. He handed back the letter with an expression that did not entirely succeed in being neutral. She established a small formal practice out of the ranch that summer. Not a building in town, not yet, but a designated room in the house with a proper desk and a sign on the door that said, simply, Marlowe Survey Consulting, which was how she'd filed the license, and which she used because the license was in her name, and the name she used was still hers. She kept Whitaker for everything else. The cases came steadily through that summer, and into the fall boundary disputes, deed questions, the occasional heir who'd inherited land they didn't understand and needed someone to translate the documents into something they could actually use. Some of the cases were straightforward. Some were complicated. One in September involved a manipulation so similar to Continental Western's method that she recognized it in the first 20 minutes and spent the rest of the week documenting it with the particular focus of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. That case went to the territorial court and resulted in a significant recovery for a family who had stopped expecting one. She didn't remember until later that September was exactly 1 year since she'd stepped off the train at Red Willow with one suitcase and barely enough energy to stay upright. Jonah remembered. He said nothing about it until the evening, when the children were in various stages of winding down for the night and the kitchen was theirs for the first time all day. He poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of her and sat down. "A year," he said. "I know," she said. "You look better than you did," he said. "That's not hard," she said. "No," he said, "but it's true." She drank her coffee. The house settled around them, the way old houses settle in the fall small sounds, familiar creaks, the particular language of a structure that had held people through seasons. "I was going to leave," she said. He looked at her. "That first morning," she said, "when you took my suitcase at the station, I'd already planned that if you looked at me the way the other people on the platform looked at me, I would tell you not to bother. That I'd find another way." She paused. "I'd been telling myself I had another way, even though I didn't." "You wouldn't have left," he said. "I might have." "No," he said. "You walked the whole length of that platform. You didn't stop walking." She thought about that. "You noticed," she said. I was watching, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, the way he looked at things he was being straightforward about, but didn't want to make into a larger moment than it needed to be. She thought about what it took to keep walking, when you were exhausted and sick, and everyone on the platform had already decided who you were. She thought about the surveying, about how you established your position by triangulating from fixed points, how you built your picture of where you stood from references that didn't move. The fixed points she'd found here had not been the ones she'd expected. Eli's drawing of the landmark he called the iron thing in the ground. Ruth's tea left outside her door. Silas offering the chest. Pearl's assessment of a quilt. A man who took her suitcase without being asked and didn't tell her why. None of those were dramatic. None of them announced themselves as the things that would hold her. They held her anyway. I didn't have anywhere else to go, she said. When I placed that advertisement. I know, he said. But I would have found somewhere, she said, eventually. I want you to know that. I wasn't rescued. I came here and I worked and I happened to find something that needed doing. He looked at her now. I know that too, he said. You've never needed rescuing. I figured that out about 4 days in. Good, she said. What I needed, he said, was someone who'd stay. Who'd see the whole thing, the hard parts, the children, the land, all of it, and choose to stay. She looked at him. I stayed, she said. You stayed, he said. It was not a speech. It was not a declaration. It was just two people in a kitchen, in Colorado territory in the fall, telling each other the truth about what had happened, which was the only kind of love story Eliza had ever been able to trust, the kind that didn't need to be anything other than what it actually was. The sign went up at the gate the following spring. Jonah carved it himself over a winter when his hands needed something to do in the evenings, and she didn't know about it until it appeared on a Sunday morning, hung from the crossbeam at the entrance to the ranch drive. She stood at the kitchen window and read it, and then she went outside and stood in front of it for a while. Every stranger deserves a fair chance. She stood there until Pearl came out to ask what she was looking at. That, Eliza said. Pearl examined the sign. Pa made it, Pearl said. I can tell, Eliza said. Do you like it? She looked at the sign. She thought about the train platform. She thought about the particular loneliness of arriving somewhere that had already decided what you were. She thought about the 7 families whose land had been quietly taken, who had never had a fair chance to contest it because the very records that should have protected them had been altered. She thought about the woman from the eastern county with 3 years of a grievance, and Cutler with his misaligned fence, and every person who had come to the ranch with a document they didn't understand and left, with a clearer picture of where they actually stood. Fair chances were not given automatically. They had to be insisted upon, again and again, by people who were willing to do the work of insisting. She had learned that at a kitchen table in October, with a candle burning down and a set of old survey notes and a bearing that was off by 5 degrees. She had learned it on a train platform in September, walking the length of it when she could have stopped. Yes, she said to Pearl, I like it. Pearl took her hand and led her back toward the house where breakfast was waiting, and Eli was already telling Silas something at high volume, and Ruth was managing the stove with the competence she'd never entirely surrendered and never needed to. Because some things you keep even when you don't have to carry them alone anymore. Eliza went inside. She was home. Not the home she'd come from, not the home she'd lost, not the home she'd imagined when she wrote a desperate advertisement in the margins of a newspaper. Something harder and more specific and more real than any of those. A home she had built by working alongside the people who were already in it, learning their language, adding her own, measuring everything honestly, and staying. You don't always know, when you're walking the length of a platform on failing legs with one suitcase and nowhere else to go, that you're walking toward something. Sometimes you're just walking because stopping isn't an option. But sometimes if you're honest about what you see and willing to do the work of it and lucky enough to find people who'll let you, the walking takes you somewhere worth staying. She had carried that in her suitcase all along. She just hadn't known it yet. The years settled over the Whitaker ranch the way good years do. Not without difficulty, not without loss, but with the particular texture of a life that has found its own shape and is no longer fighting against it. Eliza's practice grew steadily through the late 1880s and into the new decade. until she was handling cases from 3 counties and had more work than she could take on alone. She hired an assistant, a young man named Thomas Reeve, barely 20, who had the same kind of mathematical instinct she recognized from her own early years, and whom she trained the way her father had trained her, in the field, with real documents, learning to trust what the numbers said over what the people presenting them claimed. Thomas made mistakes. She corrected them. He improved. She told him once that the most important thing she could teach him wasn't how to read a survey. It was how to notice when something wanted to tell you a comfortable lie. The numbers never lie, she said, but the people recording them do. Your job is to tell the difference. He wrote it down. She didn't know if he understood it yet, but she'd said it, and eventually he would. Silas left for Denver at 18 to begin his training with the Territorial Survey Office, a position that Harvey Cross had helped arrange, and that Silas had earned on the strength of an aptitude examination that reportedly surprised everyone who administered it, except the people who knew him. He was not a warm correspondent. His letters home were functional and precise, describing what he was learning and what he had found difficult and what he had corrected in his own work. No embellishment, no performance. Eliza read every letter twice. She wrote back with the same directness, answering his technical questions when he had them, asking about his living situation and food and sleep in the way of someone who knew that the practical details of a young person's life mattered as much as the professional ones, and who understood that Silas would not volunteer that information unprompted. He came home for the winter of his 2nd year in Denver, and he was taller and quieter in a new way, the quiet of someone who had been living alone and thinking a great deal. And on his 2nd evening back, he sat at the kitchen table after supper and said, without preamble, I used your bearing analysis methodology on a disputed claim in Jefferson County last month. The supervisor had missed it entirely. I found it. Eliza looked at him across the table. What was the discrepancy, she said. He told her. It was a different situation from the Whitaker case, different terrain, different type of manipulation, but the underlying method was the same. A bearing shifted consistently in one direction to benefit a single party. The supervisor tried to tell me it was field error, Silas said. What did you do, she said. I showed him the distribution pattern, Silas said. Random error distributes randomly. I showed him that every deviation in the survey favored the same party. He looked at it for a while, and then he said I was right. Was that hard? She said. Telling a supervisor he'd missed something? Silas looked at her. Yes, he said. But you told me once that the record is what survives when the people aren't there anymore. If the record is wrong, it stays wrong until someone corrects it. So you correct it. She had told him that, not in those words. But that was what she'd meant, and he'd taken it and made it his own, which was what happened with the best things you tried to teach people. They didn't repeat them back to you verbatim. They rebuilt them from the inside out. Good, she said. You did right. He went back to Denver in January, and the following spring he was made a junior field supervisor on a federal land claims project, which meant he was 20 years old and making decisions about boundaries that would persist for decades. She thought about that, sometimes about the lines he would draw and the futures that would depend on them, and she found she wasn't worried. He would measure honestly. She knew that the way she knew a few things with complete certainty. Eli became an engineer the long way through apprenticeship and study, and a stubbornness about the specific problems he wanted to solve, which were always the ones involving water in places where water was scarce. He spent 2 years working on irrigation projects in the southern part of the territory before coming back to the county, with a design for a channeling system that could serve 6 ranches from a single diversion point on the creek. He presented it to Jonah first, at the kitchen table, with hand-drawn plans spread across the same surface where Eliza had once laid out the survey documents. Jonah looked at the plans for a long time. This would work, he said. Yes, Eli said, with the confidence of a man who had spent 2 years making sure. For all 6 ranches, Cutler's place too? Cutler's especially, Eli said. His eastern pasture has been dry in August for 20 years because the natural gradient pushes the water south. This corrects it. Jonah looked at the plans again. Then build it, he said. It took 2 summers to complete, involved more arguments between Eli and the neighboring ranchers than anyone had anticipated, and worked exactly as designed. The August drought that had been an annual fact of life in that section of Pryor County became, for the first time in memory, a manageable problem rather than an annual catastrophe. Cutler shook Eli's hand when the water ran where it was supposed to, and then he looked at Eliza, who had come to the first full run of the channel. "And," he said, "your family is expensive to have as neighbors. All this competence makes a man feel behind. You found us first," Eliza said. "At the courthouse steps. You asked me to look at your deed." "Best question I ever asked," he said. Ruth stayed. That surprised some people and didn't surprise Eliza. Ruth had the ranch in her the way some people have a particular place in them. Not because she'd never thought about leaving, but because she thought about it and kept arriving at the same answer. She learned every aspect of the operation with the methodical thoroughness she'd been applying to things since she was 12 years old. And by the time she was 22, she was running the practical management of the Whitaker property, with a capability that exceeded Jonah's own at that age, which Jonah acknowledged openly and without embarrassment. "She got it from her mother," he said once to Eliza. "She got some of it from you," Eliza said. "The stubbornness," he said. "The reliability," she said. He considered that. "Same thing," he said. Pearl became a teacher, which nobody who had ever been talked at by Pearl as a small child found surprising. She taught in Red Willow, at the same school she'd attended, and she had the specific gift of making children feel that what they were learning was genuinely interesting rather than something being done to them. She was also, by every account, relentlessly cheerful, in a way that was somehow not annoying, possibly because it was completely genuine, and people could tell the difference. She came home on weekends and filled the house with the same noise she always had, and Eliza found, every time, that the house had been slightly too quiet without it. Martha Fenwick retired from the dry goods store in 1893 and sold it to a young couple from Kansas. At her going-away gathering, a modest affair at the church hall, she found Eliza and said, without the discomfort of their previous conversations, "I've been thinking for years about what I said at the train station when you first arrived." Eliza said. "Let me finish," Martha said. "I said you looked half dead, and I said it where you could hear me. And I want you to know I've thought about it many times, because what I was actually saying was that I'd already decided who you were before you'd opened your mouth. And I've never been right about that kind of decision. Not once in my life. You'd think I'd have learned sooner." Eliza looked at her. "You came to the wedding," Eliza said. "With preserved plums. That was the least I could do." "It was enough," Eliza said. "It was the start of enough." Martha nodded once, with the brisk finality of a woman who had said the thing she needed to say and was not going to make more of it than it was. It was not a grand reconciliation. It was two women in a church hall in Colorado Territory acknowledging, plainly and without theater, that things had gone differently than one of them had expected, and that the difference mattered. Eliza thought that was probably the most honest kind of resolution available between people, and she respected it. Jonah's hair went gray at the temples in his early 40s, and he didn't notice until Eli pointed it out, and his response was to look in the mirror once and then never mention it again. He was not a man who spent time on things he couldn't change. He put his energy into things he could, which meant the ranch, and his children, and Eliza, and the specific ongoing project of being a person who kept his word. He kept his word about all of it. They argued sometimes about money, about how much work Eliza was taking on, about the right way to handle a difficult situation with a neighbor, about whether Eli's irrigation project was worth the investment before it proved itself. The arguments were real ones, not performed disagreements, and they resolved the way real arguments between two stubborn people who respect each other eventually resolve through. Someone conceding a point, or both of them arriving at a third position that neither had started with. She loved him in the way she'd told him love might arrive, not sudden, not theatrical, but built from years of shared work and argument and winter storms and children's laughter and hard decisions and the kind of trust that only accumulates when someone has seen you at your worst and chosen to stay anyway. He had seen her worst. She had seen his. They had both stayed. That was the whole of it. And some evenings, when the work was done and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, and they sat together in the kitchen, the way they had in the beginning, two people at a table with coffee, and whatever was on their minds, she thought about the woman who had. stepped off that train with one suitcase and begging for a single night's shelter. She had believed she possessed nothing. She had been so completely wrong. What she'd carried inside that suitcase and inside herself, through the fever and the poverty and the platform and the courtroom and all the years after, was the same thing she'd tried to teach Eli and Silas and Thomas Reeve and every person who'd come to her with a document they didn't understand. You measure honestly. You don't adjust the numbers to say what someone wants to hear, or what would be easier, or what would protect you from a difficult consequence. You measure what is actually there, and then you say it, even when it costs you something, especially then. The sign at the gate weathered over the years, and Jonah refinished it twice, and eventually Silas made a new one from better wood when he was home one summer, with the skills he'd accumulated and the time to do something with them. He carved the letters himself, the same words, "Every stranger deserves a fair chance." It hung at the entrance to the ranch for the rest of their lives, and travelers on the road sometimes slowed to read it, and some of them, the ones who'd been on the road a long time, carrying something heavy, not sure what came next, found that it meant something specific to them in that moment. Eliza never knew those people's names, but she understood, in the way you understand things that have been tested against reality and survived it, exactly what they were feeling when they read those words. She had felt it herself, at a train station in the fall a long time ago, before she knew that she was already home.